The Elder Scrolls reigns as one of the most celebrated role-playing game series ever created. And though it's beloved by generations of gamers, it has gone through stages of storyline revision, gameplay changes, and new development teams for each title. Ted Peterson was there early on in the series' formation. Spearheaded by him, Julian LeFay, and Vijay Lakshman, Arena kickstarted the series we know today. He also served as one of the core designers on Daggerfall, as well as writing, quest design, and lore for Morrowind as a hired contractor, with similar writing work for Oblivion. All in all, Ted Peterson wrote nearly 200,000 words of in-game books alone, and stands as one of the most influential creatives in the role-playing game industry today. By chance, he watched my interview with Julian LeFay, and we ended up connecting. The following is a mildly edited recording of our interview, where we'll discuss Ted's start in the gaming industry, his involvement in the Elder Scrolls, and what he's been up to since. I hope you enjoy. All right, thanks so much for doing this interview, Ted. I'm a big fan of your work, and it's awesome that we connected through Julian. I just happened to see your comment the other day and connecting with that, so that's pretty cool. So just so everybody's clear, I've read tons of credits and things like that. Just so we're clear, what is your exact role in the Elder Scrolls? From your words, what would you say?
Sure. Well, I was hired on. You know what? I'm going to turn off a fan back here.
Sure, no problem.
I was hired on to Bethesda pretty much right out of college. They were looking for a writer, and they had done a Terminator game, and they realized that they, I think the way it probably was Julian who phrased it like this, that they had a really robust editor, and they thought that any monkey could put together a level using their editing tools, but they needed someone to write the dialogue in between, and this was on Terminator 2029, to describe what the mission was all about and what you were supposed to do, and kind of create a fiction around it. So I was hired on as, I think my title was junior writer. And then by the time I did 2 Terminator games, and then by the time Arena came around, I was a writer / designer. And then I was lead designer on Daggerfall and maybe another Terminator game. It's 20 plus years ago, so I'm searching back. So I think my title was designer and writer, I guess.
So you might have been working on. So you definitely worked on 2049. Did you also work on Future Shock? Is that right?
I worked on. I'm trying to get my Terminators straight in my head. So I worked on the add-on disc for 2029, which was called Operation Scour. I only remember that because it was my first. And then I worked on a game called Terminator Rampage, which was the same engine as Arena. There were 3 people on that title. There was a designer, a programmer, and an artist. And what's funny about the game, it's not a good game, but what's funny about the game is that I think there's like 45 levels that you fight through, and you can watch the engine develop as you play through it. So as you begin, there's a whole bunch of sprites that are the furniture, and it's like an office building. And as you're going through, the couches and everything will rotate because they're 2-dimensional sprites. And then by the time you get to level 9 or 10, we had developed the technology to have things like half-height walls, so we could create blocky couches and things. And all of a sudden, there's 3-dimensional furniture starting at like level 10 or whatever. And the development time was so fast, you couldn't go back and like redo the stuff that you had already done. So it just, you can kind of play through it and watch an engine being developed.
That's actually really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, not probably ideal, but you really want to have an engine done before you're finished with the design of a game. But
yeah, I mean, GameWeb was so different back then. I remember nowadays, it's not unusual for a new IP to take like 4 years to develop.
Right.
Back then, it's like, we need this game in like 9 months, and it's like, okay.
We always had a concept of Bethesda, and other companies have a similar concept where we didn't think of everything as being our A game. We very early on, Arena had been discussed a lot, prior to me coming on, and continued to be discussed, while I was working on the Terminator games. And it was always a thing of, we will create this game like Terminator Rampage to stave off the wolves while we're working on the big game that we want to work on.
Right.
So along the way there was Delta V, which I worked on a little bit, which was a kind of a cyberpunky flight simulator, and there was I'm trying to think there was a Future Shock, Terminator Future Shock, and there was Terminator Skyrim. I worked on Future Shock, which was the non-multiplayer version of it, but it was I think was that was Skyrim. I think that was the first one that had kind of first true 3D enemies that you battled with, if I remember correctly.
I'm trying to remember. I think that if I remember right, Future Shock was using the Daggerfall engine, or the same engine that Daggerfall used, the X engine. And I remember it had fully 3D vehicles and things like that. I think the enemies were still sprite based, but I could be wrong on that. I'd have to look at it, but I'm sure.
I wouldn't swear on a Bible. So.
Okay, cool. And as far as your involvement, you left Bethesda after Daggerfall, and then you were a contract writer and quest designer. Is that pretty much accurate?
I was. I mean, certainly more for Morrowind than for any of the other games after that. A Morrowind, I definitely wrote a bunch of books, and I was sort of independent, like a consultant. So
right.
Yeah. So when we wrote, I don't think that we ever ended up with a real Bible, which is ridiculous for a game with that much lore. When I left there, so it was sort of a lot of things were in my head. And so there was a part where, and obviously they did Redguard and Battlespire, which neither one of those games I had anything to do with. So they had already kind of begun creating some new original lore. But yeah, by the time Morrowind came around, there was I did do some consulting, and then I did a lot of writing for that and for Oblivion.
Great. All right, I think that clears it up pretty well. Let's see. So first question is, Arena is well under development when Ultima Underworld came out. I think it was about a year between Ultima Underworld and Arena, but it's quite often cited as the main inspiration. How much do you think the release of Ultima Underworld had on Arena's development?
I mean, I think it's impossible to overstate it. I mean, there's... I'm glad they didn't sue us. No, I mean, but I say it as a joke. I mean, they're still very different games, but I mean, I don't think that we would have, in a big picture, we would have thought of doing so many RPG, basically making it into an RPG, if that hadn't existed. That we had really had in mind an action game, and then just because we're all RPG players, there was enough of that, what would you call like RPG light elements that you might sprinkle into that. But really playing, and it's both Ultima Underworld 1 and 2, because I think both of those came out before Arena. I think it was like 92 and 93. So both of those were, and honestly, I can't remember the big difference between the two of them. But I mean, everything from the interface, I mean, the paper doll system, to and like going back to what I was saying before about even having the idea of having an RPG with the first person point of view. I mean, there had been a lot of games with first person point of views up to then. I mean, obviously, the Wolfensteins and Doom was under development at about the same time, and we were getting regular uploads with what they were doing in that. I remember working on Terminator at the time and going like, oh no, like their levels are so much better than ours. Because they had a finished engine before. But just realizing that, when you're a role-playing game player, how natural a first-person point of view is when you say, I am entering a role. I'm entering into, a character that I've envisioned as a thief or a wizard or whatever, and I'm seeing the world through those eyes. It seems weird to think that way, but that was new. So it was the most natural thing in the world to say, okay, well, we can start moving things in that direction. Even from the design point of view, I think this was Ultima Underworld 2, had it was like the second level or something where you enter into this. It was kind of like a frozen pond, and they changed the way that the interface handled it. So everything was much exaggerated because you were basically sliding on the pond.
Yeah, I believe that was 2. Yeah.
And I think it was right around there that they had these headless ones who were much more powerful than you could be at that level. And they always kicked your ass, and you basically learned that you needed to stay away from them. And then later on, you revisit them, and you were powerful enough that you were beating them up, and it was so satisfying. So, for better or for worse, a lot of the idea that came from the early Elder Scrolls of having the possibility of running into some things that you really just have to run from was inspired by that, because we liked the evolution of you then having the satisfaction of kicking their ass later on.
Yeah, it's a sense of power, which I think that the earlier Elder Scrolls games did really well, where, you'd go into a dungeon, sometimes there would just be an insanely powerful monster, and you might not even have like an ebony weapon or a weapon or whatever, and you're just swiping and you can't do anything. So the idea that you'd have to like maybe retreat or, figure out your tactics. Like, believe it or not, I streamed, I think, Daggerfall a few weeks ago, and I ran into exactly that. I ran into some harpies or whatever. I didn't have a dwarven weapon, so I had to like run and figure out some spells and stuff like that. And that's sort of
and find some place where they're not hanging around to sleep.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think you're right about Ultima Underworld. I did a retrospective on Looking Glass Studios a couple years ago, and if I remember correctly, it was something like 9 months between the two. So, but after Ultima Underworld, which really redefined what it was to be an RPG in a lot of ways. I mean, it was fully 3D. There's sprite monsters and stuff like that, but a fully 3D terrain in the age of the same year that Wolfenstein came out, which was a 2D game masquerading as a 3D game.
Yeah.
It was all one plane.
But they would call it a 2.5D.
Something like that. Yeah. Doom was the same way. Doom tricked you a little bit better at it. They had fake elevation, but it was all still one plane essentially. But it's very, very clever. They made it so that you could run Doom on like, I think, a 386 or something like that. So it was very, very optimized. But
yep.
I think it was 9 months or whatever for Ultima Underworld 2, which is an insane that's an insane deadline for a really big, expansive, cutting edge game like that when you think about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, that's interesting. Okay, cool. So, I remember, I think you mentioned Legends of Valor a lot. I've not played the game, but are there any other obscure games that we could look at for inspiration? Things that you've played that you've not quite seen again or not quite captured that same element since?
Right. Well, I mean, I think that I referenced Legends of Valor at some point. I mean, I played the hell out of that game.
Right.
And I have a weird relationship with kind of bad games where if there's something in them that I feel like, needs to be dug up, like I tend not to have a lot of patience with like really flashy, the games that were, that everyone likes and seem to be very well balanced and everything. I mean, the Legends of Valor was, and a little bit like the Ultima Underworlds, that it was not only, first person point of view. It took place in just a town, and you were wandering all over, and basically imagine if Daggerfall just took place in Daggerfall, but I mean, it was really the same size as Legends of Valor. Like it was a big town, but it wasn't, the size of Great Britain. And you just felt like there was always some mystery that you kind of needed to uncover. And again, the nonlinearity of both of them were kind of like feeling like you could play it however you wanted to. It was, definitely inspirational. I'm trying to think of any obscure games that we were playing at the time. We were playing, and they're not obscure at all, but we were playing a lot of pen and paper role-playing games at the time. So I think that coupled with those particular games coming out with that sort of nonlinearity and real, because of the point of view and perspective, immersive world that you were going into. But we started off playing a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, and then we kind of at one point switched into Vampire the Masquerade had just come out.
Right.
So that's really more Daggerfall than Arena, because that ended up causing us to change the whole character creation and character design system of saying, no, you don't level up in Dungeons and Dragons ways of collecting gold and killing monsters, but it's a skills based world, and the more like in the real world, the more you backstab someone, the better you get at backstabbing, or using the school of magic or whatever. So even though that's less of a high fantasy role playing game, that really influenced a lot of the direction, as well as in Daggerfall. We had vampires and we had vampire clans, and they had, depending on where you became a vampire, they had different, abilities. So that's a direct design change from it. But there was, philosophically, there was more of a change from that.
Yeah, it's cool. I love the lore in Vampire the Masquerade. I played it a bit over a couple of years, and I played all the computer game adaptations as well.
Right.
And it's a really amazing, they talk about Bible, like they talk about vampires' history through the Victorian Age, the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, all the way back to biblical times, literally. And I think that was one of the best, probably the most fleshed out settings I've read is the Vampire the Masquerade setting. It's amazing.
Oh no, it managed to make sense in the world of, there was just enough, this could happen, this could be, why they're vampires, but if they're that powerful, why do we know about them? And well, this is why, and this is their history. Yeah, that's amazing world building, and the characters again are things that when we were playing it, you could say they figured out. Some people like to play. I know Julian would play a Tremere, the super logical, kind of wizardy ones. But we had ones. It'd be funny, like the characters who would want to, some big fat artist would want to play, the beautiful, vampire types, and you just go like, oh, it's you don't know whether it's role playing. You don't know whether it's a reflection of how you view yourself, or how you wish you were, or what your ultimate fantasy escape would be. That's the fun the fun aspect. And from my point of view as a game designer, I ran most of those campaigns, and it was interesting to go, how much information do you want to give people in order for them to kind of fill in the blanks and feel like they're going on their an adventure that makes sense for the kind of thing that's fun for them. But obviously that's the advantage that a human, game runner, dungeon master or game what storyteller, I think was what they called it in Vampire. Or
yeah, it was storyteller and vampire, dungeon master in D&D. But yeah, that mirrors a lot what Julian was saying last year when I interviewed him. Is that like a computer game is kind of like the worst game master you could ever have, because it's very linear, like it's very robotic. You either choose option A, B, or C. Like if there's no option 57 where you just say, screw this, I'm going to go do something completely different, and I think it kind of shows in, I think the kind of heart of tabletop games kind of show in Arena, and particularly Daggerfall, I think, where, the game does have a story and it does like lead you down, paths, but you can't just say, forget that, I'm going to just explore this town over here and rent a room. And it kind of has the freedom of it approaches the freedom of a tabletop game in ways that not many games nowadays do. And I think that's kind of what kind of gives it sort of an immortality in a way, is that it's more of a freeform game, almost like a fantasy sandbox or a fantasy life simulator, more than an RPG game, more so than a lot of other games these days, where they kind of narrow you down a certain path.
And I will say, obviously, I agree with Julian's assessment. Maybe not quite to the same degree, because I have played some bad tabletop RPGs, and ones where the dungeon master was really trying to push you away from exploring and kind of coming up with something new that he had to kind of make up on the fly. And I remember one time, and this wasn't Bethesda, that somebody else was running a campaign, and we created our characters and went through. Creating characters, I just should take a whole lot of time, because you should be, I want to do the characters like this, and I have to, balance this with this and whatnot. And so you take all this time to create a character, and then we started playing it, and almost all of us realized within, I mean, charitably 30 minutes, we went, we're playing the Temple of Elemental Evil. And the guy was like, oh yeah. And I was like, that's the module that like is the first module of Dungeons. Like we all know this one. So don't, make up your own or come up with something else. But yeah, there are bad pen and paper role players. That's, I guess my only comment on that.
No, for sure. I think it was kind of making a point about it. Obviously I've played some absolutely awful RPGs in my day, tabletop RPGs, and DMs, they can vary from like every single, gold piece is accounted for and pre-written and detailed in the world to, hey, let's go on an adventure. I'll make up the character's name and the conversation on the fly. There's like the extreme either way. I personally kind of like somewhere in the middle where like you've written out a couple scenarios, a couple encounters maybe, but how those encounters arise or the context around them is that more up to the players. That way you kind of give them a sense of freedom as well as
sure.
You're not completely
and there's a part where like for me it was always easiest where if we didn't do super marathon sessions, if we would do, and again, obviously we were doing this between the crunch time of Arena and the crunch time of Daggerfall, so didn't have a huge amount of time to do, huge marathon sessions anyhow, but it was, as someone running the campaign, useful to say, we'll do an hour, 2 hours or something like that, and then break. And then I have an idea of where this is going, and I can prepare for the next one. And
yeah, that sounds pretty good. Yeah, small chunks and some preparation. I mean, yeah, it really sucks to be stuck at some point and you have no idea what's going to happen. You just have to completely come up with something off the fly, and you don't remember a character's name, or you don't remember that they had an item that would totally undo this entire encounter or whatever. So yeah, there's lots of different philosophies on that. I like it somewhere in the middle where it's somewhat freeform, but also you have some preparation.
Well, I can't let this go completely without mentioning, as far as bad dungeon masters. The first time I ever played Dungeons and Dragons, my dad was the DM. Like it was almost when Dungeons and Dragons first appeared, and so he read all the rule books and knew what he was supposed to do. And I got together with a couple of my other 10-year-old friends, or whatever age we were, and we created our characters. And we're wandering through the forest, and a elven archer shows up and kills all of us. And he was just like, "Well, that's how the dice turned out." And we're going like, "Okay, you're never playing with us again. Like this, you're a terrible dungeon master." So,
yeah, I mean, some people play it as they lie. There's the kind of notorious, I think they call it fudging or whatever, where it's like, I don't really want to do a TPK just yet, and so they're like, right. that wasn't a 20, that was a 15, things like that. But yeah, I find it kind of interesting.
Yeah. But that said, I'm sure people would say like they died early on in Arena, or they died early on in Daggerfall. So that's the equivalent. So it's ironic that I thought that was a terrible dungeon master, but people probably think that I did that to them.
No, I've gotten comments on my videos about people how they can't get out of Daggerfall's first dungeon. I'm like, okay, good luck if you can't beat that one.
I understand.
Yeah, totally. All right, so let's go to the next question here. So we talked about some of the gameplay influences. How about some of the thematic influences? You're obviously a really avid writer and a reader as well. What are some of the books that probably seeded some ideas or inspired the Elder Scrolls, you think?
Well, certainly at the time that we were working on them, and I feel like I brought Julian into this, but it might have been the other way, or maybe we just came to it at the same time. For some reason, I was reading a lot of history and a lot of things about the Italian Renaissance and the Borgias and the Medicis, and then a lot of stuff about ancient Rome. I was reading Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire and watching things like there's a 1970s BBC series called I, Claudius. And really, especially on things like on Daggerfall, where it was all about the political machinations of who's going to be the king, and Wayrest was an area where there were three royal children who were kind of battling with each other about who was going to be the heir of the kingdom, and what really happened behind the scenes of these battles and things like that. So there was a lot of in terms of story and theme and whatnot, a lot of that in there. But I mean, you kind of pull inspiration from random places. There was yeah, I mean, especially when I'm thinking of like short stories, because a lot of a lot of the books that were in, there weren't any books in Arena, but a lot of the books in Daggerfall, just we realized we wanted to kind of fill up. We had lots of bookshelves, and we wanted to say, oh, you can read them, and just whenever had a downtime would say, oh, I can take this basic storyline and make it, this won't work as a quest, but maybe this would work as a as a book. So yeah, I think again, history, not a lot of fiction.
I read somewhere that Man in the Iron Mask had some influence on Daggerfall in particular. Is that something you remember?
Well, I think there was the Prince. There was the Prince and Sentinel, who had been kind of imprisoned away. Honestly, I don't remember the complete details about that, but I remember that was kind of the storyline where that fell into play.
Okay, so that particular plot hook was inspired by that. Yeah, it's interesting. I actually watched I, Claudius a while back, I think like 10 years ago, and for like a uber low budget BBC production, it was actually really, really good. I mean, that had Derek Jacobi, Brian Blessed, and some really talented actors. But yeah, I can kind of see a lot of the
William Hurt.
Yeah, William Hurt. Yeah,
for
sure.
Like Yella. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh God. Now having flashbacks. No, he did that character very, very well.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, that
right. It was low budget. I mean, it would be hilarious where the people would Caesar would turn to the side and say, "I will speak to the people," and blah blah blah, and then all of a sudden, like you'd hear boo boo, and like tomatoes would come flying by, and he'd be like, "Oh, the people don't like that," and I mean, non-comedically, but you'd say, "Wait, nowadays you could just turn the camera and show some extras or CG characters or whatever,
stock footage or whatever." Yeah, but I remember one scene in particular. I think it's Claudius. He's actually like signing this important Roman document with a pencil, and I'm like, "Is that a pencil?" It was just kind of knocked me out a little bit.
That's a pair I haven't caught, but yeah, that would be funny.
But no, this is a great show, and I can kind of see that kind of Roman intrigue where you've got Tiberius and Nero later on, and all those kind of people all vying for power. I can kind of see that. I think Daggerfall was definitely probably the most had the most intrigue of the games that I recall. It had a lot of interbattling. I mean, I didn't even realize how many factions and things that you guys put together in that game until I looked up a fan site where they listed like how this faction is associated with Rothgarian Mountains, and like they are allies with the knights, so and so, and with the Fighters Guild, and if you upset this guy, he's gonna influence the Fighters Guild, and they'll so you could have no idea why somebody hates you, but there's this whole huge machination of mechanics behind the scenes determining your reputations and stuff, and there's a whole lore behind it, which I find is really fascinating.
Well, thank you. Well, I mean, we should have filled in more of those blanks. Sure. The idea was to tie those in and then make it into something that was it doesn't have to be completely transparent that the reason why you hate you is blah blah blah, but it can't be completely based on logic that the player is never exposed to. So yeah, there's in between part, but even there'd be, just talking about intrigue. Obviously the main quest has a whole lot of intrigue, and so assassinated so and so had an affair with so and these people want to be heir, and but even things that would come outside of it. I mean, we wrote I wrote the Wolf Queen story, and I think that I can't remember what it's called, the history of the emperors or of Daggerfall or whatever, but that touched on, well, these were the kings and queens, and then this group died out for this reason or whatever. And it was fairly dry, but there was certainly there was supposed to be a hint of that type of intrigue. And when people are ruling over a gigantic empire, there is going to be a lot of backstabbing and manipulation.
Yeah, I think that was definitely it kind of created a sort of a gray morality in the universe rather than just, the goodly king tells you to do this mighty quest to defeat the demon Blah.
Right.
It's like that's had only been done a couple thousand times, It's like having some kind of, is this guy trying to help me or is he just going to stab me in the back later? Like that kind of obviously, adds a lot more to the story and kind of makes it more like a real world rather than just a, binary of good and evil. But yeah, I mean, I think that Daggerfall in particular was very opaque in some cases where you had no idea why certain things were happening, but they did make sense if you understood the game, kind of almost reading it into how the game actually works, which you shouldn't have to. But I think nowadays games have almost gotten too transparent. Like if have you played the Telltale games at all? Where
Sure.
Where like if you say something, it's like John didn't like that, or Sally hated that, or Sally will remember that. It's like a little bit too transparent.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think games that are a little bit too deep or too opaque, people can't quite read into why things are happening. Sure. So they kind of had to be a bit spoon-fed, but somewhere in the middle, I think, is pretty good,
Yeah. Well, I mean, the storyline and a lot of that stuff in Daggerfall was a reaction to Arena, because obviously you know the history of Arena and how it changed from what it was originally conceived of, which was well, first of all, it was an action game, before we made it into an RPG. And there was so much stuff that was already sort of tied into this overall, very cliched evil wizard, good emperor. You are the emperor's champion. You must defeat the evil wizard. Because the idea was that as a straight action game, the wizard was a big bad that you fight at the end. So you just fight through a bunch of levels until you fight the evil wizard. And we changed a lot of that, and we got pretty good reviews for Arena. But one of the comments was, God, what a cliched story. And and as a writer, you go, I hate that, like like everything about this except for the writing. And they're like, okay, well, I'm gonna double down and just like throw every super mixed up storyline into a pot, and now you're gonna love me.
Yeah, no, actually, now that I think about it, it's actually almost like old. Probably not by accident, more like an Ultima story where you've got your king. You got to save the king from some evil demon or wizard or whatever. I mean, you could at that point, not to denigrate your work. I think Arena was pretty great, and obviously it inspired a multi-billion-dollar franchise. So it was very impactful. I'm not
going to trash it, but the storyline was not.
But I mean, you could practically swap it with Lord Britannia, instead of Septim, and you'd pretty much have an Ultima game. I mean, it was pretty much like that. But it's interesting how I think video game storytelling, as technology improved and as particularly RPGs and adventure games as they matured, stories got a lot more complicated. Like Daggerfall definitely got a lot more subtle, and there's more depth to each thing. Like the Emperor, you assume, is good, but he's also got like, hey, if you could grab that letter that I sent to the Queen, like there's a little bit, there's more angles you could look at it. Maybe the Emperor had something to do with his death, or maybe they were, had something going on there. I immediately got that as soon as I booted up Daggerfall, which I think was kind of a sign. I think Daggerfall, along with some other really good games around that time, definitely helped mature storytelling in games.
That actor, I so many people have asked me who that actor was, who did. I mean, I wrote the script for that opening scene, and kind of suggested how it should be delivered, but he nailed it. I mean, especially considering he was some guy who was doing. This was at the time that Bethesda had bought a company on the West Coast, who had done a game called Necropolis, but they had all of the technology to basically do those those type of cutscenes, and the guy who plays Okado, the battle mage in the background, was one of the programmers there.
That's funny.
But they found the guy, this guy to play the Emperor, and obviously later on he's played by Patrick Stewart. So not bad for this guy to kind of originate a role that later on Sir Patrick Stewart is playing.
No, I think he's great. I from what I've read, he was like a local theatrical actor or something like that. I
Yeah,
don't know if that's accurate, but yeah, I think he did. I think he aced it. I think he had the right look and everything, and he kind of has that sort of stagely, kind of like Claudius, as we're talking about, kind of that stagely sort of, Brian Blessed, Derek Jacobi sort of classically
sure.
trained kind of look to it. And I think, honestly, I think that that opening was probably, it's short. It got you into it. It was like, it was, if you probably turn the lights on, it looked kind of campy, but it was just dark enough. It was just kind of gloomy enough. It was just brief enough to really be really impactful. And I think it's probably the best opening of all of the series. It just had the best kind of opening, I think, is to start with a really big mystery.
Yeah.
I think that kind of nailed it. Arena kind of told you the whole deal from the beginning. Like,
And I think it was really texty. I think I feel like I watched a video. I haven't played Arena in a long time, but I feel like there was a lot of text, that you had to wade through in order to figure out what was going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think the beginning part was pretty much all text, and then you had a voiceover with the vision of the woman who's telling you things like that. But it's like 50-50.
Right.
But yeah, obviously as technology improves and you could have like CD-ROMs and stuff, you can actually afford to have audio on your games and not completely run out of hard drive space. But
remember, we were doing all of these were like floppy disks. Like the Arena was released on floppy disks, and later on there was an Arena CD-ROM version. And at the time, I remember debating whether or not CD-ROMs were. I honestly don't remember what side of the debate I was on. Although I feel like I remember Julian saying like, why do you need that much stuff on a CD-ROM? And then Myst came out, so like, oh, okay, well, so.
We should have bet on zip drives. That was the future. I mean,
absolutely. And that the when you're talking about people who played roles of the woman whose name just escaped me, who's the character in Arena, who's kind of guiding you through. Jager Thorne's assistant.
Yeah, it's escaping me too. I'm trying to remember it. I'm sure I could probably pull it up in the.
But she was one of the programmers on Arena also.
Rhea Silmain?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep. But yeah, she was one of the programmers on Arena. So, again, grabbing who was around.
Yeah, it was a really common thing, actually. I remember System Shock, I believe, like half of the, that was the game that actually introduced what was now become a staple of games, which is like the audio logs. That game kind of originated that. And I think most of those actors were just programmers and
so that was Looking Glass again?
Stuff. Yeah, it was Looking Glass again, yeah.
Yep.
Great. Yeah, really influential studio. They didn't really get the success themselves, but almost every game you see now has something they borrowed from those games, essentially.
Yep. Life isn't fair.
No. Well, they're doing a new Ultima. Did you hear about that with Paul Neurath? He actually, he got the rights to Underworld, not Ultima Underworld, but Underworld, which I'm surprised he got that from EA after all this time. I'm really surprised, but yeah, that's looking up. I think that's being released this year, so we'll see how that turns out.
Yeah. So fingers crossed for sure.
For sure. All right, so let me go to the next one. Let's see. So this is a while ago, but I remember there's an anecdote in one of your interviews that you mentioned where you were at Surtech with the Wizardry team. I think it was Wizardry 7, maybe 6 or 7. I'm not sure which. And you were mentioning what you're trying to do with Arena, and now it's going to be a big open world and cities and multiple nations and tons of dungeons and stuff like that. And one of the, I don't necessarily want to bring the person's name out, but one of the people working on Wizardry like laughed at the idea, literally, I guess. I was curious if you ever talked to that person again, or if you feel that the success of Arena and then Daggerfall and those kind of open world RPGs that came after that, do you think that kind of effectively put a halt on games like Wizardry and I think Ultima? Yeah, they both experienced like at least a 5 or more years of kind of slowdown, and eventually kind of died out as well. Do you think they had an impact on those games?
Well, I mean, again, like that specific anecdote, which was funny, and I actually have the people who who I had the conversation with are continue to be friends of mine. So it's not it wasn't it was a laugh, but it wasn't a mean type of thing.
Right.
but they knew better than we did. We came into RPGs, even though we had made games before, we came into them as fans and didn't really know what we were getting ourselves in for. So they were the wise veteran talking to like the eager recruit who's going like, oh, you know, I'm one of you now, and this is what I'm going to do, and this is what I'm going to do, and this is what I'm going to do, and they're just like, here, you know, good luck to you. Like,
Yeah.
there's no way. But as far as I mean, there certainly was never an intention. I mean, we didn't make Elder Scrolls in a reaction either really for or against Wizardry and Ultima. I mean, those games were doing well at the time. Probably say more Wizardry than Ultima. I mean, Ultima, at least I always think of it. I mean, I think there were some first person Ultimas too, right? Or were they all?
I think Underworld was the only first person Ultima. I think they always stayed third person.
Yeah, maybe
they did.
Yeah.
I think the last one, Ultima 9, I believe it was, that was fully 3D third person.
Right.
And Ultima Online was isometric actually, but those are very successful.
Yeah.
But I think
the isometric thing. I mean, I think that's you played that because that's what you had, and it wasn't until Underworld came out that you went, oh, you know, this perspective makes more sense for it. I feel like the last Wizardry ones were also from a first person point of view, but it was a party, so there'd be, you know, alongside, so it'd be this weird, like, you know, whatever 8-person point of view where it'd be a first person, but all 8 of you were, you know, were checking it out at the same time. And I mean, there are things that we really wanted to do between Arena and Wizardry, still related to between Arena and Daggerfall, still related to Wizardry. That and I'm not going to get these right, but between 2 of the last ones, you could save a file off, and that was your character file, and then you loaded up the sequel, and your character kind of continued their adventure, and that seemed like, you know, that is very tabletop RPG, where you go, all right, my characters are going to play through this module. All right, now we're 8th level. We toss that aside, pick up the you know, the module for the next one, and play that through. So I remember we encouraged our like, I think there was probably a file that you could save on Arena that would save out your character's data. But really, when we changed over how characters are generated and it's a skill system, that wasn't really tenable, and we tried to say like, okay, well, maybe we'll you know, the characters will be translated in this way, and then after a while we just had to. And I remember we had to nuts. This was obviously pre you know, World Wide Web days, when, you know, on the various message boards, the update on Daggerfall is that you're not going to be able to port your characters over, and there was definitely reaction. But I, like, from my point of view as being someone that thought that was really an important feature, I thought they'd just like, they'd crucify us, and, you know, they didn't. So I think there's a part where probably I was with the fans of Wizardry who were maybe not dying out, but on the way. I mean, there are other features like I think in both Pro Ultima and Wizardry that you would do things like you'd have your and go back to the pen and paper days, where you'd have on the side your graph paper where you'd be marking, you know, figuring out your dungeon as you're going through it.
Yeah.
And we felt like people criticized later Elder Scrolls as being kind of getting too mainstream or whatever, but we thought we were getting super mainstream by like giving you a map. you wouldn't have, like, imagine if you had to play Arena or Daggerfall and not having it like an auto-generated map on there. It's like, you know, oh, you're lost. Well, you should have been making a map this whole time. Like that was the attitude of designers towards players.
Yeah, I remember back when games came with boxes, and at the end of every manual, there'd be like 8 pages of notes where you could just write down notes and stuff like that. And earlier adventure games and stuff, you totally had to. You had to write down, you know, okay, well, I took a left turn here and a right turn there, and I went forward, and then I pulled the switch, and that's the solution or whatever. But nowadays, like, you know, some games literally have like a reminder just on your screen at all times, push this button, or, you know, talk to this man. And it's like it remembers for you. And I guess that's I guess it's kind of to be expected in a world where we all have cell phones, that tell us what to do at any point in time. But it does kind of take away a little bit of like, I know there's definitely people who would get completely lost and without that kind of navigation, but it does kind of take away a little bit of I figured this out. It doesn't really feel like you figured it out when you're just told.
Yeah. And again, it goes back to the pen and paper role players, because that's how you would do it, is you be mapping out your dungeon as you go. Like, I guess you remember the early Dungeons and Dragons. And as a dungeon master, I kind of steered away from this, eventually, where it was like, because there's a part where it just slows down action. If you're just like, all right, I went 10 meters ahead, well, I guess fill in this square over here. Hold on, my pencil broke, and that's just like death. But yeah, I remember watching, and this is a little bit off the subject of the map thing, but I saw some time ago a walkthrough for, maybe it was a walkthrough. I think it was just like a modern. I think when Arena became freeware, I watched something where somebody was reviewing it, and I forget. And I think this has probably changed. I haven't played the last couple editions of Dungeons and Dragons, but certainly in the early stages, AC, armor class was the higher the worst, and which is
THAC0.
But it's counterintuitive if you're just thinking higher numbers are better. So the guy was going over and like dropping on a helmet and all these things, and going like, why is my armor class getting worse? and you just want to talk to the screen and say, I'm sorry, back in the 1970s, there was some logic behind it, and we brought it 20 years forward, and people have figured it out since then.
Yeah, I remember I kind of got into D&D backwards. I played some of the computer games first, and then got into the tabletop games later. But some of the early ones were very much true to the old school. I think there was D&D, then there's Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. A lot of games were based on the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, where they had THAC0, to hit AC 0, I believe that's what it stood for.
Yep.
And then there was the, obviously the D system, where like, I was super confused as a kid. Like, I got this sword and it's like 1d8, and I'm like, what does that mean? Is it 1 to 8? Yep. Or now I know, what that means now, because I played tons of games like that. But it definitely, they definitely kind of simplified and kind of made it more straightforward. And from a computer standpoint, it makes more sense to tell you 5 to 20 damage rather than 46 or whatever the translation of that is.
Sure.
But I could definitely see the whole backwards thing. It's like, but I put on armor. Why is my THAC0 lower now, or whatever? So.
Right. No. It's improvement, and you want to shout to the screen that, no, that's good, but.
Yeah, systems
I can't remember what this was in regards to. We were talking about kind of the decline of some of the old school RPGs and the rise of other ones. I mean, again, obviously, we had a ton of respect for those who came before us, and I remember there was, and I don't remember who won it. The same year that Arena came out, there was a wizardry game that came out, and there was we were at some conference, and we were at tables next to each other, and they were talking about what the role-playing game of the year was, and somebody else won it. We both looked at each other with solidarity, like, we made real role-playing games, and whoever they were. So
yeah, no, Arena at least won one. I think it was Computer Gaming World, but back then there wasn't. Now, I mean, a game can win like 200 Game of the Year awards from different outlets, whatever. It's like ridiculous. But back then, it's like there was a few, and they were more selective, and they were more niche driven,
Sure.
So it wasn't. It's still kind of a make believe award for the most part. It's just like whatever they pick for the time. But it's still definitely a feather in the cap, because there wasn't that many Game of the Year awards back then.
Yep.
I remember. I think the Julian or something else I wrote. A lot of games, like you said, Wizardry, and I think Dungeon Master, the game, and Might and Magic. Those were the kind of where you go through a dungeon, you can turn left, you can turn right, you can go forward, and they had like four party characters, whatever, on the side. Wasn't at one point, probably early prototype, wasn't Arena going to have a party on your screen? Yeah. So it was going to be similar to that.
Yeah. No. I mean, that was that's what I'm saying. There certainly wasn't any attempt to we'll bear those. We have a completely different idea. It really is. It's a mixed match of different game ideas, and yeah, I mean, it always felt weird just having a couple of and you felt like all of these characters on the screen are really versions of yourself. So there's like, okay, well, this guy who's over here is the projectile guy, and the guy who's over on this side of the screen is your brawn fighter, and you're like, well, can we just mix all of these different ones and have it just be the one guy? Like, well, you're not really getting a party is a fun thing to play in a pen and paper role playing game because you've got your buddy over there who's who's playing the fighter, and you're discussing with him strategies, and like, you do this while I'll do that, and it makes sense on that level. And obviously moving into multiplayer role playing games. But yeah, as a single player role playing game, it really should just be a single player, single role.
Yeah, I mean, there's some people who love the micromanagement and stuff like that, and there's obviously some really great tactical games, like XCOM and whatnot. But in terms of role playing, it is a little bit. Sometimes it's just so much micromanagement when you have to order a whole squad around, especially in real time. Like you're clicking this guy, like cast a spell, attack, shoot an arrow. It does get kind of a lot. And so if you're just focusing on more of an immersive experience, and I agree, I prefer a single character as well.
And you mentioned XCOM. I mean, yeah, that's a semi role. I mean, there's role playing elements in that as well. But yeah, if you're going to embrace that element of it, then it makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, one of my favorites is Fallout, actually, which took it looks like XCOM on its surface, and I think they mirrored the XCOM, pretty much matched the XCOM look and kind of a lot of the rules and things like that. Also GURPS, I believe. They based the rule set on that. But what was cool about that is you still played a solo character even when you had a party. The party was AI, so it still kind of felt like you had other players, so to speak, because they would do their own thing. Sometimes for better or worse, sometimes they'd shoot you in the back accidentally because they have bad accuracy or whatever. But that kind of created an interesting mix of solo play plus, other characters. But yeah, I mean, there's so many ways you can do it. I always preferred solo or, AI party members, but, there's been tons of really good games like Baldur's Gate, for example, you had a whole party, but that made more sense because you were looking down at them, I think. The first person where everybody's all kind of like in one, like I kind of almost imagine them as like a big gelatinous cube of people just kind of like moving from square to square.
Yeah, absolutely.
Never really made sense to me, but all right, let's get to this next question here. So this is actually a friend of mine had this question who really loves your work. Was let me get this pronunciation right. Sheogorath, a author insert.
Well, and I've heard the name pronounced different ways, but originally because
Sheogorath.
Well, because my name is Ted.
Right.
Full name Theodore, and when we were kind of creating character names. She, Dor, Gorath. So Sheogorath was sort of how I pronounce it, but I've heard it's obviously has a kind of a Lovecraftian, Shigarath, aspect to it. But yeah, I mean, there's a part where you do a lot of author insert, and it really wasn't my first one. In Arena, there were a lot of riddles as you go. I think every one of the main dungeons might have had a riddle or something you had to input on your keyboard. And there was a puzzle in one of the later dungeons where you get to a fountain, and there's a reference to who the architect was, and then later on when you get to the end, it says I am the architect of this hell. Who am I? And it's a non-riddle. It's just, did you explore enough of the dungeon that you found where the author basically signed their name? And the author's name was Theodoros, and so I created that one. So there's a part where as you're creating these ones, and you're just trying to come up with, you've been working 18 hours that day, and you're trying to come up with what is the person going to have to input at this point? Well, hell, I'm just going to put in my name, and that's what they're going to have to figure out. So yeah, I mean, obviously we did a lot of naming the Aedra and Daedra after people were involved in the project in one way or another. So it'd be I think Julian talked about Julianos, and we had our beta testers that we called our Council of Wisdom, who weren't paid, and so they
Oh.
they got immortalized as characters in lore, and I put in myself. So I don't remember anything specific. What the question was about what he print or.
Was it an author insert? Like, was it kind of your way of speaking to the player directly, almost like a semi fourth wall? Like, what it was based on your name, but was it kind of like your way to kind of speak to the player directly? It's kind of, it seemed like it almost started out as like an Easter egg, right? Almost like because it's based on your name and you figured out that particular maze.
He's not an Easter egg. He's in Daggerfall. He is. Well, first of all, I don't think he was in Arena, right? I think he came about.
I'm not a lore beard, so I couldn't say for sure, but specifically the question was about Daggerfall. Yeah.
There weren't Daedra in Arena. We had demons, and that was again one of the moves away in terms of lore from the cliched good versus evil, evil wizard stuff of Arena to something where we're going like, okay, well we don't want to make everything like we want to have some things that are big, scary, powerful. They don't mean they mean you harm creatures out there. But when we wanted to say that I'm not going to say devil, I'm not going to say demon, but what's something, it has to begin with a D. So it's going to be, the Daedra. And then we decided to make them kind of Daedra of different kind of unpleasant things. And there was a Daedra of madness. And that was where I decided I belonged. So.
Okay.
But I don't remember. He's not an Easter egg because he's at the very end of the game. You go to the Mantellan Crux and he's there. So it's
yeah, no. Sheogorath is canon and everything like that. But I was referencing your quest you were describing in Arena. So that sounded kind of like an Easter egg where you just kind of hid your name in there. Was that an actual quest in Arena that you were talking about, where you get to?
Oh yeah, no, it was a main quest. I didn't hide myself very well in either one of the games. It's definitely I'm not. Yeah, I'm right there.
Oh no, that's fine. I was just curious if that was like if you kind of based Sheogorath. Is that how you say it?
I don't even know. However they say it in the most recent games. I always called it Sheogorath, but
Sheogorath. Okay. Well, I mean, you created him, so you get to decide it. Yeah, it's one of those things where there's like no proper way to say it. Was that kind of the question? Was, again, this is my friend's question, really, so he'd probably have a better way of explaining it. But was it like an author insert, kind of like your way? Were you kind of inserting yourself in there as a character? Or was it just a completely lore based character that you just happen to name yourself after?
No, I mean, I think that there's. Yeah, I mean, it can't be coincidental that, Julian, based on his personality, is the god of, logic, and me, based on my personality, is the god of madness. So, I mean, I think that there's a part where, as we're working on the game, there's a natural yin and yang, and that type of aspect, and Julian didn't write it, so there wasn't any part where Julianus came and talked to you. So that was. That was certainly my decision to like the madness of the storyline of Arena really needed to have a madman who was sort of narrating it.
No, it's one of the most popular Daedra princes, I believe. So I mean, it's definitely. I mean, they made later on. They made a whole. That's a future question, but they made a whole expansion about him. So I mean, he's obviously pretty popular. All right, so next one. So let's see. So yeah, this one's basically from what I've seen. Obviously, you had some of the groundwork in Arena, but in a lot of ways, the lore of the Elder Scrolls kind of written backwards, where you just kind of like named things. Like even I believe it was you that said where you mentioned, or somebody mentioned, where basically Arena was like the name of the game even after it stopped being about arenas.
Right.
And so you kind of either you or VJ wrote in the blurb about like how the Tamriel is known as Arena, and I think VJ just kind of pulled out of his hat. It's also called, this is the Elder Scrolls, basically, like as a prefix. So a lot of these ideas, as good ideas as they were kind of just kind of thrown together, and then over time they were fleshed out. What do you think the biggest challenges you had with world building and creating a completely new setting were in regards to that?
I mean, there certainly were challenges, but the advantage of being involved most strongly in the first two Elder Scrolls games is that we were creating it and we didn't have to worry about contradicting anything. So there's a part where, Elder Scrolls Online, I have a lot of respect for the fact that they will dive into the lore and try to dig things out and make sense of them, and try to make those into reality, because we really had. I definitely remember the time where we brought in the map of Tamriel, and like it was huge. It wasn't digital; it was a physical, paper map that was the size of like two desks that we put on the table and just started kind of filling in the blanks and saying like, well, I like this name on this for this place, and naming what the seas were going to be, and and it wasn't just one person. I mean, it was I know that obviously VJ and I were involved in it probably the most, being the designers at the time, but I almost like my way of imagining it was there was a little bit like it was like a birthday card that was going around the office, where when somebody would come into the office, they were just like, oh, I'm going to name this little town over here, and go from that. So, and their names have survived that I all kind of like shudder, going like, oh, I think that was kind of a placeholder name at the time. So I mean, creating the world of Tamriel in the beginning, and the good thing was that in Arena we didn't have books. We had a bunch of place names. We had a bunch of kings. We had random dungeons, but we would create names of things later on got background. So like the Underking was mentioned in Arena, that he was, but it was a random thing where it'd be going, like a king would send you on a quest and say, I need you to go retrieve the sword from this dungeon. Be careful, agents of the Underking will undoubtedly try to stop you. And we had a list of, if the Underking is the one who's trying to stop you, then skeletons and zombies and like these are the ones who will be generated to try to stop you, because we had a general idea that the Underking was all about undead things. And then we had another one was the necromancers, and the blades were all about, be more straight ahead swordsmen. Like, so the blades were, a lot of the factions were introduced in Arena, but they were these general concepts of antagonists, of people who might, fight against you. And so and then when we came to Daggerfall, we said, okay, well, somebody who's working for the Emperor is going to be your first contact. Well, she's part of the Blades. Who are the Blades really? Well, the Blades are the agents of the Emperor. And then we're going to bring in all these factions and kind of start to explain them. So my most involvement in the series was as the person who helped to put down the very broad strokes and then helped to start to explain those broad strokes. And then future people had to, in ways that I could agree with or not disagree with, but in some way further refine those elements, which is a challenge. If when it's a single person world building, whether it's Tolkien or J.K. Rowling or whatever, it's impressive. It's impressive on one hand that they will just do this on their own and just like build down the world and figure out, okay, well, this is the kingdom and this is the background, and this is its history, and this is who's in charge of it now, and this is what his problems are, and like all of that stuff, which is really fun to just like leave the world, the real world behind you, and think about this other place, but it's all on you also. So when it's part of a team and somebody's coming along with a different idea and it's kind of evolving on that, then that's also fun with a different challenge.
And I definitely can kind of see that. It's also, you also had the disadvantage against somebody like J.K. Rowling, where you didn't have like 4 years to write a book. You were also had to make it a living, breathing world that you could actually interact with too, like a game. So you're wearing multiple hats there. It's interesting how you said that some of the names and things like that are in the Tamriel were kind of almost like you said a birthday card everybody signed on. I was curious. I just, as I was researching locations, because I now live on the East Coast, but I'm not really familiar with New England that much. So I was looking through there and I'm like, hey, wait a second. Isn't there a place called Somerset just below Bethesda? So was that Somerset?
Somerset. Well, there's a Somerset in England. It's one of the counties of England. And I'm not going to try to do the accent, but they have a really funny, distinctive accent, but they're kind of in the southeast of England. So there's a lot of English. I mean, I was English major, and when I think of high fantasy, King Arthur and all of that come immediately to mind. When you're talking earlier about influences, Marion Zimmer Bradley's *The Mists of Avalon* was definitely something that I know that Julian, VJ, and I had all read previously, but it was something that was something we always discussed as something we thought was awesome. So I think that there's Somerset. I'm fairly sure we were basing that on the English rather than the Bethesda located one.
Okay, yeah, I was curious because just south of Bethesda, there's a county, I think, or something like that called Somerset. And I was curious if that's where it came from, and I think it's kind of been outed now. But did you or one of the guys was Skyrim a pun of Middle Earth, Sky, Middle, Rim, or Sky, Earth, Rim, Middle? It was kind of like the opposite.
I wasn't the one who named it, so I like it. I think that's we certainly did puns otherwise when we had Elsewhere as being theoretically kind of a stand-in one. We were like, all right, we haven't named this province yet. Well, that's Elsewhere. So
no, it's great. It's actually some of my favorite names in the lore. Actually, was Elsewhere and Skyrim. It just rolls off the tongue. I thought it was kind of funny. If you break the words down, it actually is literally the opposite of Middle Earth. So I thought that somebody had a clever idea there.
Yeah, that wasn't me, but I like it.
No, it's great. All right, so I think we pretty much already talked about this. How pen and paper RPGs were, how they influenced the game. You kind of would play it in between game design. And was there anything else about that? I think we pretty much covered that, didn't we?
Well, I mean, there's parts, and I think you talked about this with Julian, or maybe not. I remember because I think that he didn't remember any direct adventures or things that we kind of used in creating it, but and we didn't really. I wouldn't say we like played Arena or Daggerfall like as an RPG. It was really more of a lot of the things that we did in RPGs ended up just being part of the lore of that, and like he would. The Durrani family in Daggerfall, which is Medora Durrani, is the one who had the affair with the king, and it was the sorceress on the island of Belfiera. That he had a Durrani family in his RPGs that a lot of things were centered around, and I think it was Venus Galarian, the original Mages Guild guy, was a character of VJ's. So we would do the geeky thing and immortalize our pen and paper role playing games, heroes as in our own games.
So it wasn't so much like you created Tamriel as your campaign setting while you were DMing. It was more like cameos and little things influencing back and forth, so to speak.
Well, there was a little bit because we and I think I think this was in your interview that Julian didn't remember. He ran the campaign in Dungeons and Dragons, which was all about someone called the Comoran Usurper, who had come up, and it was set in High Rock, and the idea was that this was we historically in game lore. This happened in the past, but there was a guy who basically came up from, I guess, the south and kind of swept over Tamriel and was conquering everything until he was stopped by a brave band of people in High Rock who had bound together. And I don't know if I gave any particular names in describing that. I don't think we played that campaign to the fruition by the time I had to write the stuff on Daggerfall. So I think I just kind of filled in the blanks and said, well, we won. And anyhow, moving on.
So that kind of helped influence the history and things like that a little bit. Yeah, that's,
and some of the town names I think we filled in those these being towns that we visited in Oregon. But I don't remember if our characters actually made it into the lore so much. But the Comoran Usurper is in the lore, and then Camorra, actually a lot of that just based on that name, you're like, well, what is a Comoran Usurper? And I don't think that we filled in all of those blanks in Daggerfall, but it sort of came to be filled in later on.
Yeah, it's interesting how it is kind of cool how the guys at ESO and I'm trying to remember his name now. The
Michael Kirkbride.
Well, Michael Kirkbride worked on more than a little bit of Oblivion, but the guy Lawrence Schick is the guy who's now doing ESO, who's not part of Bethesda, but is kind of he's like the lore master of ESO now. And I noticed little things from like Daggerfall and Arena pop up in that game, and it's cool to see them. I don't think they really work within the context of the MMO because like you were the chosen one as well as these 1,000 other guys as well. But it is cool that they kind of go back and pick apart little things of the earlier games and bring it forward. Like they brought the big golem, the Numidium and stuff like that. They put that in the game and things like that. So it is cool. But yeah, it's obviously it's no comparison. It's not fair to compare a very small team in like 1994 or whatever putting together an RPG compared to 20 plus years of people, like a whole team, building little tiny compartments of lore based on that. I mean, obviously the more time you sit on something and the more times you have to write little aspects, it's going to be more fleshed out just from the amount of man hours that go into it.
Sure. And it goes both ways because there's a part where there's a whole lot of stuff that we did in the first Elder Scrolls games because we didn't have a lot of time, we didn't have a lot of budget, we didn't have a lot of people who are also looking over our shoulders. So we could, hey, we're going to have bare-breasted women as you walk into this room, and there was never a discussion that maybe we shouldn't, or just like, well, that's the type of world that's going to be, and there's no market research that says, for this reason. I mean, the ESRB hadn't come out yet, so there wasn't a part where they go like, oh, well, this will knock our rating into this category. Remember the first time the ESRB came about, it was while we were working on Daggerfall, and there was a question on it because I just wanted to figure out what the rating of it is. And it's like, can you kill innocent people? Yes. Can you get rewarded for killing innocent people? Yes. And I was I felt like I was bragging, like, yeah, this is an awesome game, and look at all because you can do all of these things. And the lady goes like, oh, well, you're like rated XXX. I'm like, oh, wait, no, that never mind. I guess that's probably bad. So like, let me take it back and kind of refigure that. So.
Yeah, I saw somebody on Twitter shared something where at one point Daggerfall was in like the top 10 most I forgot what the word they used, but like the most mature and inappropriate games on existence. And I'm like, whoa, really? It's like,
yeah,
it's funny how there was such a knee-jerk reaction. I mean, there was a lot of things going on at the time as well, but
that was announced in the Senate. Like I think Senator Lieberman, almost was vice president, denounced it as the equivalent of digital coal in your stockings. Wow. I'm sure he didn't play it. But.
Yeah, well, like I said, maybe it sold a few copies. The things that are edgy and ooh, that's too mature. I better try it out.
I remember we were playing Vampire the Masquerade at the time, so like we were into kind of sexy goth stuff.
Yeah, I mean, some of it actually makes sense. I mean, there's a certain amount of censorship that you can kind of work around and be clever about. Like there's the famous way that I think Red Dwarf, if you've watched that show or read that book, like they came up with their own swear word so they could swear all the time. Things like that are kind of clever. But the same time, like maybe Dibella, in the Dibella religion, maybe it should make sense that everybody's naked. Who knows? It's like sometimes makes sense, but yeah, obviously that wouldn't have been done today because ESRB would be probably adults only or something like that. So, but yeah, that's really interesting. All right, so next one, I thought this was kind of interesting. I've been replaying. I did a 78-minute documentary on Elder Scrolls a couple months ago. And during that, I was playing all the games from the very beginning all the way to now. And I noticed this. Basically, I noticed that there's like a kind of an algorithm for the quests, like a randomized quests where like, you must meet X at Y within Z time or, W or whatever. Was it a challenge for you to write compelling quests that way? Or do you think that's kind of a dated way of doing that and we should just do tailored quests? Or what are your thoughts on that?
I think, well, I mean, there's certainly a part where it was the most efficient way for us to do a game in that amount of time with a team of our size. And the argument, I can immediately also I'll do the opposite argument, but the argument in favor of that is, certainly there's a limited number of stories out there anyhow. So there's a part where, you can break down all your favorite movies, all your favorite books by being, well, this is an escort quest, or this is, a slay the big bad quest, or, a lot of them, it's the details that end up making, we were talking about J.K. Rowling, something more than it basically ends up being Harry Potter against the big bad, at the end with, 9 books later. So, all those things, you can, a story can be really simple, and what the quest is can be really simple. But I don't think that it's terrible to have some procedurally generated. I think if you spend enough time with procedural generation, like the lines should blur, and it should be procedurally generated based on what the player likes to do and what the player is playing as. I think that actually, I can imagine a future which is a blend of creative input from writers and graphic artists and whatnot, doing their own vision, but letting the player be another party in the creation of this. But there is a part where the reality is you do that because you want to have enough gameplay and enough things that players can do to get gold and get weapons and whatnot. And it does break the wall a little bit when you hear the same dialogue over and over again that says, "Greetings, so and so. I need you to kill a fill in the blank here." And you want to add a little personality, but as soon as you add some personality to what the guy's doing, then it becomes even more transparent that this is the 17th time that you've heard someone make that same joke. So yeah, it's what we had to do. I think that you can it can be done better. And I think there's something to be said for a world where everything is much more crafted around there, but it doesn't also have the same shelf life. That after a while you go like, oh, okay, I've played the same thing over and over again. So
yeah, I guess it all depends on how much work I guess you put into it. I mean, like if you have 10 finite quests, 10 finite tailored quests versus 100 randomly generated ones, I mean, you may start to see the pattern. So either one will be repetitive, either run out of quests or you'll run out of unique quests, so I guess it's just however you want to spend your time on it. But I think Julian mentioned a similar thing with terrain and procedurally generated terrain. Like if you make enough tiles and enough unique things to populate it, it'll fool you much further, but it just all depends on how many, Lego pieces you have to fit that together, narratively or, as far as the environment's concerned. But it's interesting. So I read that you'd talked about this briefly before. I've kind of felt it as well, where a lot of modern mainstream gaming audience basically can't see past graphics or presentation. So a lot of like less ideally presented or older games essentially kind of don't interest them. Do you, as production values increase, do you feel it's kind of a problem where people are spending so much time and effort and budget on presentation and graphics that gameplay has to kind of suffer or become simplified because of just the extreme costs of developing those worlds? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, I mean absolutely. There's a part where you can watch, you know, you can read Shakespeare and it's still meaningful and it's still being taught and it's still something that people have a reference to and it's not forgotten. And old movies, you can watch a silent movie like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and still go like, wow, that's amazing, impressive. And you can take it with that context of this is also the era that it was made in, and they didn't have the technology, have sound, and they had different references, that we have today. And it's a shame. I mean, you still hear that from people who will. I'm trying to even think of a reference, but it'll be like, oh, that was before my time, or that was, I wasn't even born yet. And you're like, well, that doesn't matter. I mean, you still should read, Canterbury Tales, even though that's, from before. I've read it. It's before my time, and it really is in a different language. So it's a shame that there isn't. There obviously, I mean, there's you and there are other people out there who, are aficionados of what they call the old school game. But I mean, even at the time that we were doing those were cutting edge of their time. So there was a part where, the people who were playing Arena would have laughed at the graphics in the original Ultima, and
right.
So it's a little bit of the, unfortunately, the nature of the beast that anything that's that technologically driven that requires you to have the next generation console or a super jacked up PC, that the old school ones are you're going to have to use a little more imagination to get into them. But you need to have a little more imagination when you're reading Jane Austen or something that's not of your era, and that should be a way to kind of transport yourself to a different time and almost be part of the fantasy. But I can also get it that when you see kind of a blotchy pixely creature on the screen and you're used to something else, that it's hard. But every generation is you can also get into the part where what's the term of the of things that are so photorealistic.
Uncanny Valley, yeah.
That's the term that I would look. The Uncanny Valley, where you can also those can be worse than something where you go like, okay, well, I really am playing a game versus trying to immerse myself completely graphically into that world. But it would be nice nowadays that video games are being taken a little more seriously and being taught in schools and like that, if there were concerted effort. Because I think that a lot of literature and old movies and things like that might have been lost if we just let people only watch what's on Netflix and not expect a certain amount of education and background into where these things came from. So yeah, I mean, and it actually even goes back to the difference between when we've talked about like how small some of these teams were that put these games together, and not just us at Bethesda, but obviously Sid Meier did most everything on his games himself, and you admire that while still going like, if you had a big team behind you, it would have been better in some ways, but maybe not quite the same. Like, oh, okay, you're really working to the small groups mindset, which gives a certain amount of personality into it if if you know the constraints that they were under.
Yeah, I can definitely see the kind of trade-off where you have, if you have one mastermind and maybe a couple people helping them, you can get a lot more tailored story, a lot more tailored world, or a lot more tailored gameplay because it's all in one person's head and it's all there kind of figuring out. Like if you've got 100 people working on it, it becomes a little bit less, a little bit more lifeless, a little bit more, of a production. You can see that
Yeah.
with movies where like indie movies where it's done by a small crew. They've got more of a precise vision rather than, a huge 500 person, production of like, Michael Bay movie or something like that.
Sure.
So, but yeah,
and it's not. I mean, sorry, go on.
Oh no, I was just going to reiterate how funny it is with video games, and I can kind of understand it in some regards, but it's also like imagine if somebody said like, "Oh wow, you're watching Citizen Kane and listening to Elvis." Wow, it'd be like it'd be so weird.
But there are, but then, like I said, there are people like you and other people who that can also be cool. Like there are the ones that you go, Ariana Grande sells, so many records, and Taylor Swift does, and not to say that they aren't talented, but there is something cool about having some background and knowledge of like where this all came from. So
yeah, and I think that it's kind of unique to our industry because with books and other things like you can watch was it Over the Moon or whatever that really like the pre-sound movie, you can watch it on Netflix. You can watch Metropolis on Netflix.
Sure.
Movies have a very well documented, very well archived history. You can get a hold of pretty much anything as far back as the vaudeville kind of stuff, but with video games, getting anything like to work past like 10 years, it's iffy. There's some games that are simply not available anywhere, and I think that's a problem that that is definitely should be looked into, because some games, like you said, like Sid Meier's stuff like that, like how, if you wanted to, how would you play the original Civilization? That's a hugely influential game. It invented an entire genre, things like that. Like it's very difficult sometimes to, especially if the official company no longer sells or provides a platform to access those games from. I think that's definitely something we should look into.
It seems like it's a realm for academics. Like there's a part where if there are courses, and I totally embrace them. When I got into it, obviously you didn't take game design as a major in college, or you didn't, and you certainly didn't take any classes or anything that was about that. And it's changed now, and I would hope that in some way there's a history aspect of it where because you can take things where you go like, and I hear this over and over again with things like Arena and Daggerfall, where people go like, oh, they still haven't done that again since then. So if you take the ideas of it and apply it to current technology, then you could create something really incredible.
Yeah, and newness of something kind of blinds people, I've noticed. Like, people are loving the Jurassic World movies or whatever, right? But I can guarantee you in 20 years, people will remember those as like, yeah, they were okay, but Jurassic Park was amazing. There's a certain amount of wisdom that occurs when something kind of gets past the age of newness. Sometimes it's like 5-10 years, sometimes it's 20, but we can still watch Jurassic Park and say, my God, that movie still looks amazing and still is, narratively perfect pretty much, but I'm sure we'll find flaws in movies that came out a year or two ago, and realize that maybe it wasn't as good, or maybe some movie will last a lot more, or some book or some game will. I mean, it's kind of interesting how that's gone. Like, we've seen some titles in the past where like it was kind of trashed at the time, and then 20 years later, it's a cult classic. Right. Blade Runner had terrible reviews when it came out, but now it's considered one of the most influential sci-fi movies of all time. So,
oh yeah, I mean the list goes on and on for sure for those ones. So, you don't know whether it's if it was like you say ahead of its time or just not something that the audience was ready for. I mean, everybody wants and I always think this about, books, games, movies, any of those things. Like nobody sets out. Everyone wants their baby. Any of these things. Any of these things take. I mean, what's the credits for a movie where it just goes on and on and on. And you just go like, and sometimes they're for a terrible movie, and you just go, oh, I'm so sorry that all these people probably worked sleepless nights, to create this thing that is bad, and it's bad for whatever reason. And sometimes, like you said, it's just ahead of its time, or there's something about it that people respond to down the line. But yeah, so that's I definitely agree.
Yeah, it's amazing how big productions are getting for both movies and video games. Like it came out a couple years ago that video games are actually a bigger industry than movies now, even though it's not as respected for some reason. But
Right.
I mean, there's more money that goes into and out of the gaming industry than the movie industry, like today.
Well, I'm still so I skip ahead a little bit. I came to I ended up moving after Bethesda, moving out to LA, and got in wrote some screenplays for movies which were optioned or sold, and none of them ended up being produced. But I worked on TV for a little bit and ended up getting into the Writers Guild. But I had so many credits for video games, which are a way for the Writers Guild to evaluate whether you should be getting into it, but you can't get into the Writers Guild, at least the Writers Guild. I'm pretty sure that either the Writers Guild East or West, based on video games. Still,
Yeah.
that's got to change. I mean, it's a part where they will. Once you join the WGA, there's there are courses about writing for new media and things like that, where people go like, oh, you'll watch some movies where you go like, that's a video game scene. Like they like people who wrote that or directed it were thinking of like, oh, what would be a cool video game scene. So it is in a weird backwards way respected, but on the other hand, the people who are actually making the video games, I think there's a part where. I mean, I think that writing for video games made me a better writer for other media, because, and I'll go back to the very first Terminator 2029, where my first time writing it, and to give Julian and VJ their credit, they liked my writing and they just kind of let me go on with it, but they never told me to bring it back a little bit, which meant that I would have these long expositions in Terminator 2029, where the various characters, they'd be telling you what to do, but they had backstories, and they were like, some characters were flirting with each other, and some characters, like there'd be a lot of back and forth. I just like watch the first playtesters just like skip through all the dialogue to like, okay, what I need to do is pick up three items out in the field, and I'm going to go out and do the thing. And as a writer, you go like, oh, that was beautiful dialogue. You skip through, but I need to make it shorter, and that works whether you're writing for TV or movies. That you say, I need to boil down what I'm trying to convey, not lose character and personality, but don't be so indulgent that you go on and on about it. I remember there was, is it Orson Scott Card who wrote The Dig? There was a video.
Is Spielberg involved in that?
Yeah, I think so. And I remember, again, this is probably mid to late '90s, and they were like, oh, all these famous people were getting involved, and there was a part where they had this famous writer who was involved, and he was allowed to write as much as he wanted to, and he just went, this is way too wordy for a video game. You're a short story or a novelist, so you don't get that. You're not afforded the luxury of just paragraphs after paragraphs. I mean, that's the good thing about the Elder Scrolls, is that when we wanted to tell that story, we could just create an in-game book, and you can read it or you don't have to read it. It's up to you. So trying to get it both ways.
That's a very interesting insight. But yeah, no, you're right about Orson Scott Card. I just looked it up. Yeah, he was one of the three writers in the Dig. So was same with Spielberg. Um, but yeah, it is a kind of interesting thing. Sometimes like a blunt, uh, and unpretty, unscripted, just like a blunt reaction to something is kind of what you need though. Because like, for example, I'm sure that a lot of people be watching. If they had the option to just skip all the dialogue and get to Bruce Willis shooting something in Die Hard, they probably would, you know, like it is a very well written movie, but like, you know, there's that kind of blunt reaction. Sometimes you kind of need it, you know, like,
I know the screenwriter.
Oh, you do? That's really cool. That was, McTiernan was the director, right? I don't remember who wrote the screenplay.
Steven D'Souza.
Oh yeah. He's done some other good things, hasn't he? I mean,
he's done some bad things. I think he wrote the first. I think it was the first Street Fighter movie, the one with Jean-Claude Van Damme.
That's campy. There's actually some really good lines in there. Like I remember specifically, like off the top of my head, I don't remember many quotes, but one line from M. Bison, like on that day, he's talking to what's her face, Chun-Li. I think he's like saying that like on that day when I destroyed your village, you know, it was the greatest or most important day of your life, and for me it was just another Tuesday. Like that's actually a really good line. Like I really like that line.
Yeah, I agree.
But I mean, movies are like that. Like there was the famous I'm sure you've heard of it, the I completely blanked out on it, the fake name that people use when they don't want to be associated with a movie, where it's
because there was another movie that had that name as part of it. It was called Alan Smithy.
Yeah. I mean, that happened to movies like from David Lynch. He used Alan Smithy once. I mean, there's movie productions are so big that it can quickly become a beast on its own, and studio interference and stuff like that. So
it's funny that doesn't happen in video games, right? I don't think that there's like a designed by Alan Smithy equivalent of somebody who divorces herself from what they've done, and they should. No. I don't know why. I don't know why there isn't. I mean, I think there's a part where. It's interesting because I know that Julian mentioned in his interview that he never plays his own games, afterwards, and I don't think at least it would be always be a thing where he wouldn't necessarily play the games, some of the competitors' games while we were creating them, and I've heard this about people who are in movies. Like there's some people, like actors, who will say, they don't watch themselves on screen afterwards. Like all they can see are, I should have done this way or that way. I mean, I'll say that I think I mentioned before that I watched. I can't remember if it was Arena or Daggerfall. I've probably seen both at some point. Somebody doing some initial, quests into it, or some gameplay videos of people doing that, and 20 plus years later, I can watch that and go, oh yeah, those dungeons were really big, and that was probably something we probably didn't need to have all of our dungeons be quite so sadistically big, but you watch that and you go like, oh, it is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, 20 years of experience and retrospect, you can fix all sorts of things. I mean, it's shows you with anything. Also, it's like you have to kind of look at it from the context of the time. Like, some of these things had never been done. Like, the idea of 3D procedurally generated, initially tool assisted procedural generation for gigantic dungeons, and like Daggerfall had something like 750,000 NPCs and things like that. Like it was a ridiculously big game. I mean, in the context, that's not even really been done since, let alone in 1996, so you have to look at, I think I'm a kind of an exception. I mean, I played Civilization 1 for DOS yesterday, so I'm kind of an exception, but,
there you go.
But, I try to look at a game like, okay, how does it match up to games now? But also in the context of when it was released, this was a pretty crazy endeavor, and it's amazing that it worked at all, so.
Yeah. Well, and that's, the interesting part, when we talk about like the old movies or things like that, we can talk about, complete triumphs of things like Cabinet of Dr. Caligari or Metropolis, but there was a lot of crappy movies that were also made at the same time, that or middling movies where you just go like, oh well, this is what they thought they had to do, and movies were based on stage plays, and you would they go like, okay, well, we're going to hold the camera still and keep it on the stage because that's how it works in theater. So yeah, there's the context of the times is technological, but it's also at the time feeling like you need to rip off a better medium, that that movies felt they needed to rip off theater, and video games felt they needed to rip off movies. And certainly in the mid 90s, there'd be the Myst, and I liked Myst, but there were a lot of games where it would be, we're just going to fill the CD-ROM with beautiful imagery and occasionally a puzzle. I mean, I'm sorry, Final Fantasy as a lot where it's going like, we're going to throw a little battle at you and then have a big anime movie that you're going to watch in between. So they can find games. I don't want to trash them or anything, but there's a part where they're nodding to what they consider to be a superior medium.
No, totally. I 100% agree. There was a period during PC gaming where we did the FMV movies where, they'd put like actual movie clips every 5, seconds and stuff like that. It was interesting. Some of those games were okay, but it was definitely not, it wasn't embracing the medium you were in. It was embracing, like you said, some other popular medium. And with like Final Fantasy is a really good example. Probably the best example I can think of is probably Metal Gear Solid, which have bits of really good gameplay in between. Sometimes I think somebody actually clocked it like 2 hours straight of like cutscenes and stuff like that, and in a couple of those games toward the end.
It's crazy.
Yeah, and it's like that's an entire movie, literally.
Yeah, a long movie.
Yeah, a long one. So it's like I firmly believe that there's some video games that story wise and narratively wise that they are comparable to real life movies, and with the advantage of obviously having you in their shoes. It's a lot more. It gets to you a lot more when you're actually doing those actions. When you're actually holding the gun against the person and they're begging for their life, rather than seeing, Bruce Willis do it, or Liam Neeson do it, or something like that. It's a lot more personal. But I can't help but think that some of these games that have amazing stories, like for example, Last of Us, amazing story.
Yeah.
Really well done. I don't want to spoil it, but there's this one scene where a situation like that where you're holding a gun against somebody, but it's in a cutscene. How cool would that be if you were actually aiming the sights and deciding whether to lower the gun or not? Like that would be so much more impactful. Like I think that's like the next step I think that we need to take, where where we embrace the medium and kind of, because there are games like there are some games like Brothers. I don't know if you ever played that game. It was an indie game a few years ago, but that game really how you control it really impacts.
I'm writing it down. No. I mean, I love to hear about games like that.
Yeah, I don't want to get into it too much, but basically, it's the premise is that you play two brothers at the same time. You have two thumbsticks I think you can do it with keyboard as well, but primarily you want to use a controller, like two thumbsticks to triggers, and so you control two brothers at one point, and so the kind of kinetic cooperation between the two brothers really kind of helps tell the story and the struggle, because you're having to work together as a team and whatever, and they do a really good job with that. And
cool.
I definitely one of the better examples of embracing the medium in my opinion. But I agree with you. Like
I have to. This is not about your point. So this is in my family. We have what we call parentheses, where it's this is not the main discussion, but an interesting anecdote along the way. It's funny. Again, I don't know if you looked at my credit. Actually, I don't think I'm listing the credits on this. Well, I know I'm good now because I didn't have anything to do with this game, except that one of the first game studios I went to after I left Bethesda was a company in San Francisco, and they did an FMV game called A Fork in the Tail.
Oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Starring Rob Schneider was the voice of the hero, and it like I came in there, they hired me on, and we had all these plans for this game, and A Fork in the Tail came out. We had a huge party to celebrate it, and it bombed so badly that there was money in the company, but apparently he needed to make a bare threshold of to have the confidence in the people who had the money for the money to be released, and it didn't make it. So the company disappeared. And so I'm obviously there's FMV at the beginning of Daggerfall, so I'm not totally anti FMV. Well, the beginning of technically Reaselming's thing is FMV, but that kind of bubble on the FMV it definitely caused some problems.
Yeah, that's crazy. Actually, I think I almost bought that. I remember holding the box in the store once. There was a definite, like I said, FMV bubble. There were some really good ones too, like their Wing Commander games later on. They had Michael McDonald and Clive Owen and some up and coming actors.
Oh, Gabriel Knight too. Was the werewolf one. It is still one where I felt that was one of the beginning of oh, okay, well this is a nuanced story, and there's some good acting going on. So
yeah, I was actually just talking to my fiance about one of my favorite games, not probably top 10 or whatever, but one of the better FMV games was Spycraft. It was completely unlike your average game where you're a CIA recruit and you get trained by Michael Biehn, weirdly enough. Michael Bihn's in there, training you how to shoot and stuff like that.
Nice.
And some of the puzzles and stuff like that in the game are actually pretty cool. There was one scene where you had to triangulate where this guy was calling. He called from a payphone, and you had to listen to this audio track again and again, and listen to you heard some birds and a train, and you triangulated it down to a certain part of the city. And there was one scene where you were using satellite footage to figure out the license plate of this truck or something like that. So they definitely had some inspiration, and they try to it was trying to be kind of like a movie, but that's not really an experience you get too much in a game, trying to think along those lines. So yeah, I mean there was this other game actually, it was fairly recently, I think it was kickstarted a few years ago, called Contradictions, which is a surprisingly good game. The entire mechanic of the game is you talk to people, and they say a bunch of things, conversation, whatever, and then you have to pick a line that they said that contradicts another line to figure out, to catch them in a lie, basically. And that's the whole mechanic of the game. And it's actually they play it up. It's a little bit cheesy. It's kind of a little bit of a cheesy Sherlock Holmes.
Well, you do have to have, for any of especially any of the FMV ones, you got to have a little bit of, a cheese tolerance.
Yeah, definitely. And this game kind of embraced that. I think that's why it works. They didn't try to make it super serious, but it was actually pretty compelling. I actually quite liked that game. It was a pretty good game. They had a kind of a cheeky British detective and stuff like that. But yeah, there's definitely some really, really bad ones, especially the Sega CD had some really, really bad FMV games. But yeah, it's funny. I remember holding Fork in the Tail. It reminded me a little bit of the Monty Python FMV game that was out around that time as well.
Sure. No, I'm looking this up, and I'm not going to find it in time for this. But when I further in my career, I had a assistant designer who looked really familiar to me. He had done, he only had his resume of the games that he had designed, and then of course I realized that he was in the Red Alert. Westwood Command and Conquer games, as one of the FMV characters in that. So it's like I said, going back to back in the day, and you'll hear Julian's voice in a lot of the Elder Scrolls games. So even if it's not FMV, it might be a voiceover or whatever. That the nowadays. Again, it's probably mostly for the better, not for the worse. That you don't want to have you'd like to have people who are good at their jobs doing, the acting and the voiceover and things like that. So it doesn't, if you're good at your job as a programmer, you don't also have to be the voiceover guy. But there's something, a little bit of charm to the idea that if you're playing some of these old games where there's a more limited budget and a more limited staff, that you might actually get a vision or hear the people who are making the game.
Yeah, I know that. I think Command and Conquer games were some of the best cheesy FMV. I mean, like the guy who played Kane, like he was actually, I think he's a classically trained actor, and he was actually really, really good. Honestly, like it was a bit cheesy, but I still remember those Red Alert and Command and Conquer, and those ones had some really. You'd always kind of look forward to the next FMV intro where the guy would like, maybe he was like now whispering to you and wonder why. Like maybe he's like trying to throw you off his tracks and he's actually like a crooked officer or whatever. Like
sure.
They made their little stories and it was entertaining enough. I mean, it wouldn't be done now, but yeah, there's a certain amount of charm to them. But I think that you have to kind of, like you said, kind of have to embrace the campiness of it because there's a certain amount of cheese that just kind of comes along with that. I mean, it doesn't have to be necessarily, but you do get the kind of like 1990s TV acting in those generally. So
absolutely.
But that's cool. Oh, good. This is a good question, I think. Let's see. Oh, okay. Well, here's one. It's been a while, so I'm not sure if you remember, but there were a lot of ideas in Daggerfall and Morrowind, especially that were cut. I remember, and I think you've remorsed about this before, where dragons were a thing in Daggerfall briefly, but didn't really happen. I think even Mark Jones actually mentions how he designed like sprites for the dragons, but they were like never used. And there's lots of other features. What were some of the features that had to be cut, like were kind of left on the cutting room floor, essentially for the Elder Scrolls games you're working on?
I mean, I was going to say the list is endless, but unlike Julian, I played the games after they came out, so I had some idea. But both of the games, Arena and Daggerfall, were certainly had features that were semi-implemented or would be implemented to the degree that you had to do X, Y, Z, and A, B, and C, and a couple other letters in order for that to even be an option. So I think that there are always like super hidden Easter eggs, probably even to this day. I mean, and things like we talked about vampirism and stuff like that were basically the whole game is an Easter egg. Certainly Daggerfall is an Easter egg that like almost everything has to be kind of discovered and you figure it out from there. I mean, I know that there were some things that were cut, and these were things that were cut not for. I know that there was supposed to be. I think I've read this before, and I went like, "Oh yeah, that I remember that." Like the not prostitute skill, but I remember that you were supposed to be able to reach the stage of reputation with a person that you were able to have sex with them, and we had created some artwork. I don't know if you probably remember, like there's the images that happen when you turn into a vampire or werewolf. That like there's a couple like they're basically painted images that kind of morph from one to the other, where it'll be like a woman with bleeding eyes that when you have that dream, that means you're about to be a vampire. And if you remember this naked guy who's that means that you're about to become a werewolf. And there were some pictures that were created with the idea that you would, I guess you would just have sex, but I don't think there was an idea that you would have children. I was excited when some other games came up which suggested that you might, as a character, have that full of a life that you could really, have a family. But at least the idea was that you would have some kind of relationship with NPCs that were out there. So I feel like that was something we were really trying to make happen in Daggerfall that didn't really come together.
You're trying to make it on higher on Lieberman's list there, huh?
I'm sorry?
Sorry, I still hear a little bit echo. trying to make it higher on Lieberman's list there with the
well, yeah,
prostitutes and stuff.
but I didn't think of it as being. I didn't think of it as being dirty. I mean, we didn't have anything where we showed anything, but it was because. But I mean, we were young, but we're adults who were making this game, so we were thinking that it when you want a game to be immersive, relationships, and that includes sexual relationships, should be a part of it. So yeah, I mean, was it supposed to be titillating? Yeah, but I mean, just the same as like the naked people in the dump of Dibella and Daggerfall, where I don't think anyone ever masturbated to those images. And like when he said, like, "Oh my god, that's not so sexy," it's like, no, this is just what they do. So.
No, it's totally valid. I mean, later on in the Fable series, they had just that where you could have, you could woo people and bring them back to your bed and eventually have kids and get married and stuff like that. That's totally part of a life sim. So yeah, I was just making a cheeky joke back there, but
no. Honestly, I never played Fable, but I remember hearing about it and thinking that they were doing something that I had wanted to do on that.
I mean, you had to kind of just think about resources and stuff too. I mean, you had sunk so much time and production into other things, and I mean, Daggerfall, I think, was like a 2-year production with a relatively small team by today's standards, especially. So I'm sure that there's probably a priority on things like getting combat to work before you could hire women of the night. But
and that's always a tricky thing. I like any of those ones where as opposed to going back to kind of our Dungeons and Dragons or Game Master, Dungeon Master comparison, where you don't. My preferred way of being a game master is to ask you what you want to play, talk to you about your character, kind of figure it all out, and then play for an hour, and then make a whole bunch of notes and say, okay, well, these are the things that like his character is most interested in. I need to create some of these characters. I need to create some of these locations, and like kind of figure it out at that point. And then in a CRPG, you can say, I'm just going to litter the whole world with everything that anyone could possibly want to be interested in. So, and meeting someone and having a good relationship with them seems like a thing that people want to do. So,
no, that makes sense to me. It's interesting. All right, cool. So let's go to the next one here. So I hear that you're the person I have to thank for the incredible character class creation system in Daggerfall. I personally think it's one of the best systems made in RPG. Like when I remember reading about in the manual where you're talking about how you could be like a cat burglar, for example, where you could like climb into people's houses, through the window or through the upstairs doors or whatever, and sneak in and things like that. That whole idea was really, really, really well fleshed out, I think. What were your, with retrospect, obviously it's not fair, you have 20 years of retrospect, but in regards to now, what additions or changes do you think you'd make if you had the opportunity?
Well, I mean, the background on it was really that, and I think I told you this before, that when I was brought on to Bethesda, they had said, like, we have these amazing editors, and we just need someone to kind of write the stuff. So one of the things we talked about when we decided to switch from the old arena style, completely Dungeons and Dragons, inspired character creation to something that was more skill based. Well, I mean, really, the idea was that we could create all of these characters through this editor and like create. Okay, well, what is an acrobat's major skills, and what are their minor skills, and what makes a person that character class? So once I started playing around with that, I said, we have, I can't remember how many different character classes there were in Daggerfall and Arena, but there were a couple dozen. But to say you could create your own mix, and why not kind of expose that to the players? And basically we expose the same system that I used to create an acrobat or a battle mage or whatever, and just let people say, all right, well, my weird character class is going to be, this weapon and this this kind of magical school, and mix it all up into something that makes sense to the kind of character they want to play.
That's really cool. What was it ever a goal to make the game completable from start to finish with non-combat? It kind of almost seemed like that was the intention. Like you could make a class that was like etiquette, mercantile, and what any other non-combat skills, but getting out of the first dungeon and getting through like the last final stretch would be pretty damn difficult. Was that was that a design goal that kind of became less real over the production, or?
I think that's fair to say. I mean, I think that there's if you follow, following the story of the game, I place a high value in design on relationships and factions and working, fighting friends and finding connections. So I think there was an idea of making it a thing. I think you would never. I mean, it's an action RPG still at its heart. So I think there's a part where you probably have to draw a sword every once in a while. But the ideal would be you are so beloved that the city guards will come rushing out and assist you if you need it, or that would have been cool.
No, I agree. I think there's been some games where they've done like a body count, like you play a game like Max Payne, which is a shooter. Body count's like 300, 500, whatever. But there are some games like I don't know if you can really do it with a game like Daggerfall because based on how dynamic it is. I guess you could if you do the exact precise main quest missions, but some games, even though they're like shooters or whatever, you can technically, like for example Deus Ex, one of my favorite games, you can actually beat the game with only 3 kills. You can actually avoid killing everybody except for 3 instances, which I think was pretty cool.
Yeah.
There are a couple games that actually you can do a completely non-violent playthrough, which is interesting. I was always kind of in the back of my mind, I was always like, man, how cool would it be if you were just like a pickpocket and that's your entire quest and your entire mission in Daggerfall, or if you were like a some sort of orator or something like that, and you just talk your way through the entire ordeal or something like that. But
remember, Tamriel is called the arena. True. So at some point you probably have to pull out. You can talk so much, and after some point you probably have to pull out a blade.
True, that is true. I mean, it makes sense for the setting and everything like that.
I'm BSing a little bit, but no, it would be great. Again, ultimately, I think that having multiple solutions to every problem, and what they call emergent gameplay and all that, is a great way to try to design games.
Yeah, it's totally. And I mean, obviously, it was still so new too. So like maybe had that gone down that road even further, maybe it was going to be more of like you can be a complete non-combat class or whatnot. I mean,
sure,
it's still pretty new at the time. And I heard from Julian that the crunch time was pretty intense. Was that the reason you left Bethesda after Daggerfall, or was there another reason?
Well, I mean, I was offered a job. I mean,
okay.
Short answer. It was hell. I mean, it was really, really tough. But again, I was in my early 20s. It was, I didn't have a family. It was a labor of love. So, I mean, it's a part where you don't want to say, I got pissed off and left, but I was working a crazy amount of hours. I was not being paid very much, and I got an offer I couldn't refuse. And we had 3 winters in a row in Washington, D.C. with huge blizzards. And I remember one time, like, going down the highway and my car, like in the snow, like turned around and was just sliding that way. And there were tow cars whizzing around, and I went, I haven't been killed on this highway yet, but it's a matter of time. I think I need to move to Southern, California. And so, yeah, I got a job offer out there for a company that didn't end up working out. The game wasn't going to be released, and then I moved to Northern California for the game I was talking about before, for the game that they had done, the FMV one, which also wasn't released because we didn't get very far into the design before they said, we don't have any money.
Oh no.
But in the meantime, a guy who was my assistant at the job in Southern California had applied for a job at Activision, and he used me as a reference, and I called up to, give glowing remarks about him, and they said, "Well, we're actually looking for a lead designer for something," and well, this is kind of funny. So I turned into the conversation was a job interview. They offered me a job. I moved back to Southern California to work at Activision, and my first day walking in there, Activision had at that point become famous for doing MechWarrior.
Yeah, MechWarrior 2. Yeah, MechWarrior 2.
And they had lost the license, but they had picked up Heavy Gear as being their replacement for that. And so, but it's a kind of a whole RPG system. So, like, we want you to come in and be our lead designer for Heavy Gear. And I showed up my first day and was going like, "All right, let's start." And they said, "We're putting that on hold for a while,
Oh, no.
But the great thing was that they then put me on Zork Grand Inquisitor. So they had they said, "Well, this isn't necessarily your thing, but we're having some trouble with our Zork thing." And I was like, "Oh my God, Zork!" Like, I came on excited to do an RPG for this, but like, Zork is literally the first game I remember ever playing. So wow, I get to be on that team. So that was really, really cool.
Oh, that's awesome. I remember playing.
I think that was a long-winded answer to. I don't remember what the original question was.
No, you answered it. You got a job offer, so that was a simple question.
Yeah.
You just elaborated, but that's an interesting story. Yeah, I mean, I believe that was Savage Entertainment was the place you left for, or was that later?
No, that was a little bit later. So
okay,
I left Bethesda for a company called Film Roman that was had an interactive company at the time. I don't know if they still exist, but they certainly don't have an interactive company anymore. And I left them for Any River, which was the one who did Fork in the Tail, which, again, my game never went anywhere with. And then I went back to Southern California for Activision. And at the time, Activision, and I think to this day, they don't have internal development. Like, they had internal development at the time.
Yeah.
They stopped that in the late 90s. And but because they didn't want people to basically go off and be competitors, they said, "Well, you're going to work for us at another studio. We're going to give you money. We're going to take the people we like and fund your own development companies." So Tim Morton, John LaFleur, and Chaco Sonny were a couple guys who had been there on a bunch of different projects for 10 years. And they were one of the people who they said, "Okay, we'll fund this company that turned into Savage Entertainment." And again, this is it was my self-deprecating humor. So they were told, "We need you to hire a lead designer." They were really pissed off at this guy who is now one of the biggest designers at Blizzard. But was working at Activision at the time, and that's who they wanted to bring on to Savage. But he had just done a game that didn't do well. It's always like the last game that you didn't do well is who they don't want to support. And they decided, they said, "Well, Ted Peterson is a guy that they can, you can bring on." So that was like, I think I was at Savage Entertainment for probably 10 years.
Oh, wow. Wasn't Zork Grand Inquisitor the first non-text game, or did they do a couple in between? I remember the first like 3 or 4 were all text-based, and then they went like full mist with Grand Inquisitor. I believe I played that a while. It was actually really good. I remember.
The thing, I had a lot of fun doing it, but it was not the first graphical Zork. I mean, there was. I feel like it was like Zork Nemesis.
Yeah.
I mean, these are even before I came along. That there were a couple ones where they tried to mix it in. But I mean, here's what I'll say about that, because we're talking about largely about the Elder Scrolls, is that coming on to Zork after like 10 games or 12 games or whatever has to be like coming on to Elder Scrolls after those many ones and going like, oh God, there's so much lore and so much background and stuff like that I need to learn about, and to be able to do, there's going to be somebody who's played it since the beginning who's going like, no, that's not quite right.
Yeah, you almost have to do a reboot at that point. I think that the Might and Magic series has done that at least once or twice, where they just completely clear off all the lore and start a new world. Like if you follow the Might and Magic series, like at some point it switches to a completely new world. And it's like, okay, we're doing it a new way now, and all the characters. I totally get. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, like, well, I was offered. Well, let me get back. I'm going to drop this on you, and you. I know you'll come back to it.
Okay.
When I was at Activision, they basically said, because I didn't get my RPG project that I was going to do, they said, start looking at licenses you want to license. And I talked to White Wolf for Vampire the Masquerade. We got them. We got Troika to do them, so I have some backstory on that because I know that's one of your games. But we, I totally was talking, thinking about that. But what were you talking about just before that?
Let's see. I was talking about Might and Magic and how they rebooted their entire setting.
Oh yeah, no. So I also I worked at Electronic Arts when they worked on. It was both a reboot. I worked on GoldenEye Rogue Agent, which is a critically reviled game. But I'm a huge James Bond fan, so it was one of those doubly painful ones where, as I'm on it, like I want to do all this. Like I know so much about James Bond, and I can talk about all the characters. And then when Casino Royale came out and rebooted it, I'm going, oh, this is what like the Star Trek people feel like when Star Trek was rebooted. And I've never been a Trekker or a Trekkie, but I was also offered the lead design on the Star Trek license at Activision because they had it at the time. And I went, I like Star Trek, but I don't love Star Trek to the degree that I think that you could probably throw a dart around Activision and find someone who is much more obsessed and would, be more true to the spirit of this thing to me.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember reading about some of the Star Trek games. I've not really covered those, but I think Secret of Vulcan Fury was one of the last really big ones. And they actually got voices from pretty much all of the original, the TOS, like the original series crew. I mean, I'm not a Trekkie, but yeah, they got Shatner, they got, I think, Scotty, they got I can believe Spock. I forget his name now, but they got like a lot of the original living cast around the mid 90s, and it was going to be this huge, you're going to have CG reproductions of all the cast, and it was like a big production, but that one fell south. That was one of the last big failure projects from Interplay. I don't know exactly what happened, but yeah, it was really cutting edge for the time. They're doing mocap and everything. But Yeah, that's interesting. So you almost did the what would have become Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, I could, because I told you that was the big game that I was playing with Julian, and at the time of Daggerfall. So yeah, it would be my number one role playing game.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think Julian mentioned at one point he almost got into it. I don't know if that was around the Bloodlines era or he almost was pulled into a Vampire the Masquerade game project as well. I guess they sent him a bunch of materials, so it seems like you almost crossed paths there again. I don't know if that was related, but it's an amazing setting, and despite it being one of the worst and bloodiest productions that I've looked into, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines is actually an excellent game. After patches, there's a whole story behind it, like where they, I think Activision pulled funding for like the last month, and so they couldn't actually patch it, even though it was just literally just sitting there waiting. It was gold. It was just waiting to be, sitting on their for a shelf or whatever. And I think for a couple weeks, people were patching it unpaid or something like that. But yeah, the game definitely needed a couple more months.
Yeah, no. There was. I think Julian was talking about how rough it was at Bethesda, but it's rough all over.
Yeah, it's a big problem. I mean, the only places I think you can really avoid the crazy crunch, I think maybe is like well-funded indie studios, maybe. But even like a big studio, even if you get like somebody like Sony to take you under their wing or whatever, you still have that corporate push, the corporate deadlines and stuff like that.
No, yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. If you're doing what you love, you just kind of put up with it. But it's not always fantastic.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because I've talked to some developers. I mean, Julian could be counted amongst one of them, or just the burnout of just doing 16-hour day, 18-hour days or whatever, nonstop for months. I think the worst I've heard was actually Bloodlines, where I think they were basically in crunch mode for 3.5 years. That's just absolutely insane. Like,
yeah, it is.
Any crunch time for weeks or months is bad, but I mean 3.5 years, that's got to be soul crushing. Surprised that
yeah.
Most of the people are still making games that are involved in there. I mean, Tim Kaine and I forget the other guy's name, but lead designer on that as well. But yeah, that would be pretty soul crushing, I bet. But that's interesting, huh?
No, I remember meeting up with them, but I mean, honestly, my takeaway was like, oh, I'm pissed off that I got this license for Activision, and I'm not going to be involved in the design. So it was not like, I remember meeting with them at the time and knowing that they were going to do it, and like, oh, I wanted to be working on that because that was what I was involved, what I was inspired by so much before. So.
Yeah, that's got to be really disappointing because you probably were like really rooting for that. But we kind of glossed over that. But since you're such a James Bond fan, I was curious. I've watched all of them except for one. I've not watched this one for some reason. It's the second Timothy Dalton one. It was Living Daylights, but I've watched the rest of them.
The first one is Timothy was Living Daylights.
The first one is License to Kill. Second one is Living Daylights, I believe.
No, I'm sorry. It's reverse.
Really? Have I been getting this wrong this whole
time?
Up.
First one was Living Daylights. Second one is License to Kill.
I thought Living Daylights was the last one before they rebooted it with Brosnan. I could be completely wrong. License to Kill. Oh, you're right. Wow, I had that completely mixed up. I hated License to Kill. But
I didn't like License to Kill either. It was forgettable to me. It wasn't a thing that I cared about it enough to.
It was too Americanized. Like, it was about I think they hid like cocaine and gasoline or something like that. It was very much like he like punched M in the gut. Like, it was just very not James Bond. Like, James Bond would tell M that something and then do another thing, but he wouldn't punch him in the gut. I don't think. It was a bit too much. But okay,
I liked his first one though. I liked License to Kill.
Living Daylights. Yeah,
Living Daylights. I like that.
Yeah, that's the one I haven't seen.
I loved the song, the theme song from the Eurotrash band that's on the tip of my tongue. There's someone who said "Take on Me."
Oh, yeah. What is that band? I'm sure I could look it on up now. But what's your favorite Bond movie?
What's my favorite what?
What's your favorite Bond film?
What's my favorite Bond film?
Yeah.
Well, you can't say Goldfinger because that's like the most obvious one, or From Russia with Love. Um,
So you're
my
definitely a Connery guy. Definitely.
no, I'm not. I mean, my first experience with Bond is Roger Moore,
Yeah.
and I mean, probably The Spy Who Loved Me has to as a huge, uh, I love that film. Everything about it. There's nothing bad about that.
That's cool. Yeah. Surprisingly, he's often considered the worst Bond. George, what's his name? He only did one film,
Yep,
but that's actually one of the best. I think the Majesty's Secret Service. I think that actually had a really good story
yeah,
and a really good arc to it.
yep.
It's easy to go with some of the original Connery ones, and Roger Moore did a ton. I know he did a ton. I think that Goldeneye was really really good, but it's kind of the more
Oh, I agree.
new Bond. I think it's if I had to pick one, I'd probably pick Goldeneye, but I think that
Well, although I liked what was the one they did where he was against the evil multimedia giant played by oh, he's on tip of my tongue.
not Christopher Lee, not that one. That
Oh
was Man with
no,
the
that
Lone
was
Gun.
way back.
Yeah. Oh, that was like the second Brosnan one or something like that. That was
Yeah,
I could look it up
Tomorrow Never Dies.
right. Yeah, that was pretty good too. Yeah.
I like that.
I think that yeah, Goldeneye was just so fresh. Like that was like a true
Hmm?
reboot. They've actually brought the same guy in to reboot the series like twice now. He did Casino Royale and Goldeneye. So I
Oh,
guess whenever they do
I
the
didn't
next
realize
one,
that.
yeah, they'll have to probably bring him in again just to reboot
Yeah,
the series. But it's a great. It really is a probably one of the most reflective series, most reflective of the era. Like you
yeah,
can watch the 1960s ones, 1970s ones, and you can see
yeah,
exactly what's going
yeah.
on. It's really really
Agreed.
cool. It's like
Totally.
it's almost like a history lesson, really.
Hmm.
But
I hear
all right.
you.
In respect to your time, let me get to the next question. How are we doing on time? Are you good for another for a bit? We're about halfway through.
Yeah,
We can pick up the pace though. I don't want to take all your night.
yeah, that's fine.
Okay, good. Let's see. So about that. So, what are you up to nowadays?
Well, I guess I can give a little, because we mentioned that and what was it? Daggerfall came out in '96.
Yeah.
So I left Bethesda really close to the end of Daggerfall. Like I definitely saw Daggerfall all the way up to testing, and then I got the job offer. And honestly, part of the thing I leaving Bethesda at that time was that I thought that they were going to release Daggerfall too soon, and that with all the hype at the time that it was getting, if I didn't jump ship and move on to another company, then it was going to be a disaster, and I would just be the guy who released this horrible, disastrous game. So I was happy to have a job offer for again double or triple what I was making at Bethesda in California, and I went around to a couple different places. Uh, you know, Ended up at Savage Entertainment for 10 years. We did a bunch of games based on movies. So we did a Wall-E game. We did a Star Wars game. We did a couple other things along that line. Um, when that went under, I worked at Disney and a couple of independent studios, uh, but that was all on the West Coast. And at this point, I'm working with a guy I met at Disney on a game that is coming out in about a week or two,
Oh wow.
coming out on Steam. That I've done a lot of the world building and lore, and I've written a couple of short stories for it, and a lot of in-game dialogue and notes you pick up along the way. Um, and uh, in the meantime, I've also started a clothing store. So actually there right now, and I live upstairs, and I'm on the East Coast. This is my life.
That sounds great. What's that game you're? I didn't see that. What's that game you're working on that's coming out soon? I should plug it in the video.
Yeah, it's called. I'll have to look it up. Eternal Darkness: The Curse of the Pale King.
Eternal Darkness: The Curse of the Pale King. Yeah, I didn't know you were working on games this recently. I thought you'd taken a break, but
well, I'm happy to work with people I've worked with before. Julian, give me a call.
Exactly. Make it happen, Julian. No, I kind of, as you saw in the interview, I kind of pushed him on it, seeing it's like if he'd ever come back, and he said he's been tempted a couple times, but he'd kind of need. I mean, I would, as much as I'd absolutely love you and Julian and maybe even VJ. VJ's doing, I think, software development now and stuff like that. But
VJ's been writing novels.
Yeah, I heard that as well. That's cool. I should read some of that stuff.
Me too.
His one condition is like a well-organized, well-funded project, because he doesn't want to have to run the show, which is understandable. Have you done much managing and stuff like that, or mostly been creative?
No. I think you reach a certain age and stage in development, you have to do some management.
Well, cool. Let me know when the Kickstarter happens.
Well, you'll be the first to know.
All right. Cool. So that answers that question. So this one is a little bit, you may not know much about this since you weren't working directly with Bethesda at the time, but the kind of otherworldly weirdness of Morrowind. I've seen a lot of sketches and writings from Michael Kirkbride. He's often credited with the kind of oddity of Morrowind. Mm-hmm. I've heard stories about how there was like, people kind of hey, kind of tone it down a little bit, make it a little bit more real, a little bit more standard fantasy. Did you were you part of that those discussions as far as kind of toning Morrowind down to earth, because it's very alien compared to the other Elder Scrolls games. So I was curious what your thoughts were on that.
Well, short answer, I was not part of any of those discussions. Longer answer is that I know Michael Kirkbride and he's a friend of mine. So and I don't know if I was part of his initial hire at Bethesda Softworks. I have actually hired him. I hired him on at Savage Entertainment, and I recommended him for other places that he ended up getting hired on to. So, yeah, we definitely have a good personal and professional relationship. Do we see eye to eye on every creative decision? Like, obviously not. But he has different interests than I do. I mean, it's actually a shame. I don't think we've ever gotten to the stage where we've really been able to work together creatively. So I think that I can imagine a way of working together. I mean, obviously it doesn't work with us anymore either, but there'd be a part where his interest in kind of the cosmic and the weird, and my interest in like the political and the way that people screw each other over, and like all the soap opera type of thing. I can see them working together. So we haven't quite gotten to that stage, but I consider him a friend.
Oh, that's great. Not bashing his work or anything like that. I was just commenting on how you can look before and after Morrowind, and you can see a very different direction for Morrowind, and that's what it gave it so much personality. I think is that it was so different. And weirdly enough, I think he's actually working at Telltale now. As far as I know, he's working on some new project there. The last I heard.
Where did you say he's working?
Telltale Games.
Yeah. Oh yeah, he is. I know.
But yeah, no, really, really. Great writer and everything from what I've seen. I was just curious. I heard that his involvement was in Oblivion was almost primarily through conference call, which I thought was pretty wild considering the success of Morrowind. Were you working in California at the time? Where you were? Yeah. Okay, so you're mostly
Both of us were. Well, I know at one point Michael was. I think they had a Telltale company in New Orleans that he spent some time there.
okay.
But I was out in California until 2000. Well, yeah, about this time a year ago. So
Oh,
2007.
you've been back to the East Coast. Do you like the more the? I mean, you probably were you born and raised in Maryland, or were you from all over?
I'm kind of from all over. I was born and raised in the Midwest. Went to school in the South. Obviously, spent a couple of years in Maryland. Then spent 20 plus years in California,
Wow.
uh, mostly in Southern California, and then moved out here. But I'm in North Carolina right now, and that's where my parents live. So it makes sense to be out here. Um, like I said, starting a different kind of business.
That's great. I heard that North Carolina is really beautiful. I've not made it up there myself. I've gone to Boston a few times. Lived in Southern California. I love the climate there. It's nice, like
Sure.
90% of the year. But actually lived in Western Washington, which is very beautiful, but very cloudy and rainy most of the year.
Yeah.
But
But here I become a snob. Like on in Southern California, we get like a little bit of rain,
yeah,
and
it's
we're
like,
like, oh my god, thank God,
yeah,
because we're so we're basically a desert. And out here, I become like, if the storm is coming and it's not thunder and lightning, like don't wake me up. Like
right.
I need a Wagnerian storm. I need something with oomph, to interest me.
Yeah, I'm currently living in Florida, which is weird because
Oh,
like
I've
Florida
been
is
so far.
like um, around Tampa Bay area. But
Okay. Oh
yeah,
yeah,
it's
you guys
yeah.
have good thunderstorms. I've been there. My
Oh,
grandparents used to live there. Yeah,
yeah. It's crazy. You don't know how fast weather can shift until you've lived around here.
yeah.
Because like Western Washington, it's a temperate, kind of like England, very similar to England actually. When I lived there, um, but yeah, here it's like it could be completely sunny and all of a sudden thunder. You don't even see
Yeah.
clouds, just thunder, and
Yep.
you're like, what? What's
Yep.
going on? Or it's like immediately starts raining for like 10 minutes straight and then stops. Like earlier this morning was crazy. Actually, I looked at the weather app because I wanted to make sure there's no thunderstorms because this is our stormy season, and I saw that it was uh 5% precipitation, cloudy all day, but I heard like
Yeah.
rain and thunder, and I'm like, okay, you don't even know what you're talking about.
No. I will do the. I won't say the name of Alexa, but I will ask her for her weather report, and it will say, sunshine and thunderstorms. Those shouldn't go together.
No, it's so weird here. There's even like strips of rain where like one time my brother was literally walking on the street and it started raining. He was like, "Wow, this sucks." Then he looked at the other side of the street on the other literally just across the way, and it was not raining, so he just switched sides and he was okay.
That's brilliant.
Very weird. Okay, cool. All right. So now I've heard about this. I wasn't unfortunately part of the forums, but Bethesda used to have a forums where the players and even some of the designers, and I've heard that you were actually pretty active on the forums as well. You went by the alias. Oh god, I forgot how to say it now. Shogorith. Shogorith.
You do you.
Shogorith. Used to kind of role play there and stuff like that, and I heard that sometimes like the interactions on the forums would actually inspire real lore that would go into the games.
Yeah.
Is there any truth to that? And what was your story and why'd you leave? Basically.
Hmm. Well, there's totally truth to that, and I think it must have been between Morrowind and Oblivion that this happened. So I don't think it was post that time. But yeah, we and I think it was Michael Kirkbride who kind of lured me into it to begin with. That they were doing some kind of they were role playing on the forums, and they basically said like, "Oh, we're gonna do like a summoning of Azura or something," and he said, "Would you join the forums and play the part of Giogora?" And I said, okay. And I think that most of the things that I post on there, like I'd like write like little poems, and it would be, or like backwards rhymes, or something where it wasn't quite what it appeared to be. And then a group of people kind of started uh, an interesting role playing thing based on that, where they were escaping what we had wrought based on that. And then it was funny because I just like jump on there as another character, and join in with the group, and be part of the story. And it's amazing because I think this must have been before I was married and had a kid, because I had a lot of time on my hands to be able to contribute to those type of discussions. But I think I just got to say, I think I remember, I think there was something where those forums at some point, Bethesda corporately shut them down, or said, like, this is not lore, and you should take these things. We don't want to support this stuff. But a lot of the stuff, so Michael Kirkbride wrote the first Pocket Guide to the Empire, which I guess he must have come out with Redguard. And then
sounds right, yeah.
And then I wrote the one that came out with either Oblivion or Morrowind. Was based on that. So I mean, I never went like what Kirkbride wrote in the Pocket Guide to the Empire is great, but there were different directives of what we were going to do with the second one, and I think it was offered it and wasn't interested, or had a problem with the dictates, and it was fine with me.
All right, so that is was just kind of declared like non-canon and not really something that they wanted to contribute, because I think they have new forums now, but there was none of the old posts in there now, so it seems like they closed down whatever old system they had, and you're just that's when you ended, pretty much, is when they shifted direction, essentially. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, which we got. I mean, but a lot of the stuff from the second Pocket Empire stuff that we had settled in this online RPG, I put in there, so it's now kind of canon. I mean, there were things, and it goes back to like a quest in Daggerfall where Morgia, who is the daughter of Helseth, who becomes a king of Morrowind, has this whole quest having to do with her becoming the first queen of Firsthold. And in the second Pocket Guide, I say, it was her child who becomes, the first king. So it was like, okay, well, we're kind of settling that up and explaining, what happened with that. And I feel like there were probably a couple other things that, kind of lore things that during the course of that RPG, we settled out, just kind of like how we did back in Daggerfall's day.
That's cool. That's interesting. It's you don't hear that many that often where like interactions with fans actually directly contribute to lore or history or writing in the games. It's kind of an interesting moment in time, I guess. So that's interesting. All right. That's next question here. All right. So I don't know how familiar you are. I don't know how far through the new Elder Scrolls you played, but are you familiar with the Oblivion Shivering Isles expansion? What happened with that?
Of course. Yeah.
That was not written by you, right? That was not, you were not involved in that.
Not even a little bit.
What do you feel about that? Because you wrote a lot of Sheogorath's dialogue and character up to that point. How do you feel about that? The biggest personification of him. How do you feel that they handled that?
I think they did a pretty good job. I actually haven't played it all the way through. But I mean, there's a part where I think that Sheogorath is I mean, he was literally inspired by the Joker, and
oh, really?
kind of like the Joker, there's a lot of ways to play him, and he can be a complete clown. He can be a complete homicidal maniac, and I feel like what works for the game is what makes sense. You know.
Okay. And so your last involvement with the series directly was Oblivion Basic, not any of the expansions, right? That's pretty much where
Right.
your involvement ended. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm not enough of a lore beard to know exactly when Akavir was first mentioned. It was kind of alluded to in earlier lore, and then it got bigger and bigger. Was there ever plans to were there ever plans to explore Akavir directly in like one of the future games, or was it always kind of like a nice out in that there's a mysterious far off land where dragons and stuff live? I know you're involved in a lot of the lore in that because it appeared mostly in books. So
well, it's funny that you mentioned that right after the Sheogorath stuff, because I just want to say this right. I think that your character in Shivering Isles turns into Sheogorath, and Sheogorath turns into Jiggalag, which was another Daedra who was mentioned. Like I wrote a book for Daggerfall called On Daedra, and one, like all the Daedra are ones that you can summon and interact with in some way in Daggerfall, except for this one that's spelled Jyllag, or maybe there's a Y in there. Anyhow, so I really threw him in as a placeholder. You're saying, okay, well, this is when I need someone else to play. I need to say someone else is a major Daedra, but we didn't mention, we haven't used him before. We'll figure out the reasons why, but fill that in. And then later, people who were taking over the thing said Sheogorath and Jiggalag are ones that are one and the same, or they switch off, which is cool. And you're like, okay, well, that's one is the one of order and one is the one of craziness. Sorry, went off on a little tangent and I forgot where we're going with this. What was the question?
Akavir, was there any
right.
plans to
So
explore
Akavir,
that?
right. So similarly, you kind of like throw out a saying like Tamriel is just one continent here, and we're going to talk about a couple other ones, and we'll see if we need to go there, if they're just a convenient one of like, why are these creatures coming over here that we haven't seen before? Are they coming from Akavir, or are they coming from this other continent or the other?
Yeah, that's cool. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it is always kind of nice to have that wider, like expanded universe out there you can kind of borrow from or pull from, and because once you explore one particular part of your world building so much, it's really hard to kind of just, oh, by the way, there's orcs, or by the way, there's goblins, or whatever. It's like, oh, where'd they come from? Why didn't we hear about them? So, all right, it's interesting. Do you have a favorite race or faction in Tamriel from a lore standpoint?
From a lore point of view, like whenever I play, I usually play as. It depends on what I'm going to be. I mean, obviously, I think I go with the cliched, like if I'm going to be a brittle warrior or whatever, I'm going to be Orsimer Orc. I love the way I'll say this for other people who've worked on lore. I love the way that the Argonians have sort of turned and been a completely different type of creature. But I think the High Elves have always been the group that maybe I had the most love for. That like it was my dream, like Morgia in the Wayrest thing of her becoming the next queen of Firsthold. As a part where you're like, oh, that's the ultimate that you can ascend to, is to join the High Elves and even be their ruler. That they seem like the one that you want to be part of.
That's cool. Yeah, I know that there was a couple times where I think there's almost a Somerset Isles game in the works, but I think it's always kind of been like, oh no, we'll do Morrowind instead. And I think Morrowind was going to be 2 at one point, and then they skipped that, and then it became 3 and things like that. But yeah,
I'm curious about post Elder Scrolls Online, what they're going to explore, because there were certain ones where we were definitely thinking, like I kind of dropped the stuff on Artaeum being like the home of the Psijic Order, and that they were this is the mysterious Avalon of the game. Like again, in Arthurian mythos, is like this is the ultimate that you can reach to, the Crystal Towers and the the Paradise Valley and things like that, where you're just like, that's where we're aiming for. And now it's kind of been explored in Elder Scrolls Online. You're like, oh, what are you going to do with it now that is going to be different than what they've already done?
Yeah, it's probably pretty odd for you having such a long and storied history with the series. Like, it's got to be kind of weird because you've probably got your own canon in your head, maybe not fully formed for everything. Comparing it to what other people have done with the series, it's got to be kind of weird, kind of comparing. It's almost like a different dimension, really.
It's like being a grandparent and going like, oh, so like maybe you can control your own children, but what your children, have, you're like, oh, okay, well that's related, but not maybe the way I would do it.
Yeah, for sure. All right, let's see. So this is probably the most important question of this entire list here is, did you write the lusty Argonian maid?
No.
You didn't write that?
I didn't. I'm not sure who did.
I put it together. I thought it was you because you have you definitely have a sense of humor and kind of have done some of the wackier stuff as well. And you also wrote something like 150,000 words of books in the games or something like that.
I wrote a lot of the books, but yeah. Like that's probably the most famous book in the game, and the one, damn it, I didn't write.
I was curious. I thought I'd found the culprit, but maybe it was Todd. Maybe it was Todd Howard. I don't know.
No. If we're gonna put money in the game, I'm gonna say it's probably Kurt Coleman.
Oh yeah, it could be Kurt. Yeah, I didn't know how much writing he did. I know he's been in design since as early as Daggerfall, so he's been around the block. It could be. I don't know.
It's not Kirkbride.
Yeah, I don't think it would be him.
No.
He always seemed to kind of be the more serious, eldritch, otherworldly kind of stuff. I don't think that didn't really fit.
I don't think it's Bruce Nesmith. I don't think he would go there. He's also pretty serious.
Yeah.
But Kurt's got a sense of humor, so I can see that.
Yeah, there's that. I found a picture of Michael and Kurt goofing around, and like Kurt's got like a Roman helmet on with a gun or something like that. Really weird picture, but seems like he could be wacky enough to slip something like that in there.
Yeah.
Was there like a big database?
And Michael has a sense of humor too. Kirkbride does too.
Oh, totally. I've seen some really wacky stuff he's done, but
right. But that's not. I guarantee you, he didn't write.
Yeah, so the search goes on. I wonder if anybody will admit. All right. So the dwarves, or I guess later on they're kind of called the Dwemer. What was your reasoning, if you had anything to do with them? I'm not sure how the lore was divided up, but was it always the plan to be a long dead race, like a deceased race, or were they going to be explored and maybe a prequel, or was maybe a faction or something of them were like discovered later on, or were they just always going to be the race that is no more? What was the idea about them?
I mean, they were the one fantasy race that we hadn't included before. So we had elves and orcs and humans and some other other creatures that are on that same length. But we didn't have a dwarf race. And I think that none of us who were playing D&D at the time had wanted to be a dwarf. So we were just like, okay, well, we should probably mention them, but not, give you the option of playing one. because there's a part where we and I'm talking about the classic D&D dwarf,
Right.
which is the same thing as a classic Tolkien dwarf. So we just sort of said, if for some reason you're a dwarf fan, like they exist, and we have dwarven metal and we have dwarven armor and things like that. So we're acknowledging them without if you don't have any reason why you would want to play them yourself, then you just kind of like leave it out there to say like, okay, well then you can imagine what it would be like to play as one of those, and maybe you'll explain to me later on what's fun about being a dwarf in Dungeons and Dragons. So we just kind of left it out there. But I think starting in Daggerfall, I think we started to make it into more of an interesting thing where we said something mysterious happened to them, and it began in the east and traveled to the west, and something happened where they all disappeared at once. And honestly, I don't remember whether we threw out some other hints other than that. I think starting in Morrowind, obviously they kind of ran with that as being an important consideration.
Yeah, I definitely played a big part in Morrowind in terms of going into the old Dwemer ruins and things like that, which was always interesting because you see all this like, this is unusual, this is weird.
I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, I was definitely appreciate that. All right. If off the top of your head, what do you think your favorite quest, book, or bit of writing you've done, and why?
I mean, off the top of my head, the one that was really fun for me was writing a book series called 2920. To a large degree because it was me as a person who wrote the lore in the first two books or the first two games, coming back to it and making a sense of it to myself. And it was a huge amount of work. I mean, anything that's fun has to be a huge amount of work. Like you can't, I mean, there are fun things that you can do, like jump into a mud puddle or whatever, but anything that's seriously fun takes multiple pages and, okay, well, this works, and like putting it all together. It was really complicated to try to figure out multiple storylines from multiple perspectives and putting it all together and that. So that's sort of the first thing that jumps to mind.
All right, that's interesting. All right. This is a long shot here, but I was curious if you ever had any of your own writing or lore pop up again, and what your most surprising way your writing or designs have appeared in something you've seen or enjoyed. Like you played later game and it's like, oh, I remember writing the backstory for that or something like that. Has that ever happened to you? Or?
Well, I mean, in Elder Scrolls Online, I think that they've brought back some things that I've written, which is kind of cool. Trying to think of outside of Elder Scrolls if anything has happened. I know that when the novels were written about the Elder Scrolls, that there was a lot of stuff that was, referenced in that, which was nice. Honestly, nothing immediately springs to mind outside of those.
Okay, that's fine. That was just a basic question. I was curious if there's any time where you just like, I remember writing a note about that in a book 20 years ago, and then all of a sudden it pops up again.
Well, it was cool. It was cool in Morrowind to see Brenzia come back, from Daggerfall, and be a major part of like the add-on onto that, and Helseth come back again from Daggerfall, and having there was obviously a big reboot or change in the lore between Elder Scrolls 2 and Elder Scrolls 3.
Yeah.
So sort of anything that came back on that was nice to see.
Cool. All right. Let's see. Post Oblivion, how do you think that the writing and or just the series in general, actually, what do you feel about Skyrim and the rest of the Elder Scrolls series now that you're not involved with it? How do you feel that they've done?
Well, in a funny way, I think there's been the people who are huge Morrowind fans don't like the return to sort of classical, high fantasy, European style, Dungeons and Dragons. So, I mean, I liked it. So it's there's a part where like I think that you need to have kind of room for the weird and room for the kind of classic stuff. I know that Julian talked a fair amount about originality and
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not you create something that is so unique and so and I hate using the word unique. Like it's like unique means one of a kind, and there's almost nothing that is completely your own creation. I think there's always a part where you want players to tell their own stories and feel like they're a part of the world that they want to be part of. And Morrowind did a great job of creating a world that was weird, but yet you could, okay, well, I'm going to still be this character within this world. But I feel comfortable in like I said, like my background is Dungeons and Dragons and Tolkien and Arthurian stories. So a lot of those are where it's easier for me to create a character within that world. So what people see as maybe a step backwards in terms of a more generic world, I'm kind of on Julian's camp of like, a generic world is one where then I become important in that world. That it's not, all about the strange tales of Vivek and, if that makes any sense to my character.
No, I can get you. I think Julian's kind of poignant quote he had is, "It doesn't matter if it's different. The only thing that matters is if it's good." And I think that was his quote in the interview that we had, which I can kind of see. Like, on one hand, you want to kind of stand out from the crowd and kind of be different and interesting and weird, and
Sure.
you don't want to retread the same exact thing that's been done 100 times, but. People love procedural police procedurals, and they're exactly the same as every other release procedural episode that's ever been done. But if they're good, they're good. People don't care, So there's some merit to both arguments. And the second question kind of dovetails into that, where it's more about the gameplay. Like, as the first Elder Scrolls game you had no part in making, what are your thoughts on Skyrim? And in respects of his like gameplay mechanics and design. I know you weren't really as involved in the design in Oblivion, but what do you think of Skyrim? What do you think that's?
Well, so no, I think Skyrim was a beautiful game, and I get what they were doing in terms of streamlining some things. I mean, they've been streamlining things like skill sets. We kind of exploded them in Daggerfall, and sort of every game since then they've been streamlining them more and more, which makes sense in the sense that you want to make sure, your earlier question where it was like, could someone be a completely, an aristocrat that is just really good at social life and can talk their way through various things. And instead of making the world in a one where you could be that character, they said, we need to get rid of these skills because they aren't useful. And things like a lot of the language skills and stuff like that in Daggerfall were not terribly useful. And certainly, I mean, they could have been useful, but not probably as major skills.
Yeah.
I get the idea of saying we're going to, either eliminate or reduce them into, smaller categories for that purpose. But there's an argument to be made to say, well, let's open it up to different types of gameplay and not make everything combat, if that's not the way you want to play the game.
Yeah, I kind of get what you're saying. Like, and I agree. I really like the idea of being able to talk to dragons and giants and stuff like that. But I think pretty much everybody could agree that they were undeveloped. I mean, I think that it was basically a skill check. As far as I remember, it was like a skill check. And if you pass the skill check, the dragon wouldn't attack you, or the imp wouldn't attack you, or the giant wouldn't attack you. But like, there was no real dialogue system or real, like, you couldn't ally yourself with the dragons or the giants. That'd obviously be a whole other system you have to develop. But like,
I mean, imagine when you could be like Newt Scaramanga from Fantastic Beasts, and like be the Beastmaster. That that would be awesome as an alternative.
No, reminds me of that 80s movie, which is really cheesy and old, but I love. But
Beastmaster, right?
Yeah, Beastmaster. Yeah. No, I think it's a really cool idea. There's so many ideas that were like the seeds were there, but instead of like improving them or developing them more, they just kind of cut them. Like, I think that there was something like at least a dozen or so non-combat skills in Daggerfall, if I remember. I mean, there's a lot of them, but I think by the time Skyrim came around, I think there's just speechcraft. I think that's all it is. It's just like all like what's left, like mercantile and talking to people, kind of just combined into one or something like that. But it's. I mean, I know Elder Scrolls is kind of known as an action RPG, but it was kind of more than that in a lot of ways. I think it did kind of dabble in a lot of non-combat roots in a lot of ways. I mean, it was kind of, born of games like Ultima Underworld and things like that, which were dungeon delvers, but there was a ton of things you could do, like arguing with people on the street to figure out the directions to the tavern and things like that, So that doesn't really exist so much anymore because you already have a completed map as soon as you enter the realm. So I was curious how you felt on that. I mean, obviously it's done really, really well, financially and it's bigger than ever and things like that. But I was curious if you played much of them and I mean, I guess kind of got your input where that's like, you kind of understand why they cut it, but you're probably more of an old school gamer where you like the different opportunities and different skill builds and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, the ideal would be to build out and to say, Daggerfall had its limitations as far as what it could do technologically and what it could do graphically, and it would be brilliant if some of those things were done more with, rather than we're bringing it more into you don't need to have a lot of creativity to be able to figure out what your character is going to be, and you also don't have as much freedom to do as what you're going to do. So but creating a game with a ton of freedom for what you're going to do is really hard, and I can see things moving in that direction again.
Okay.
We'll see with 6.
Yeah, 6 is definitely. We'll see a trend. I mean, I know that Fallout has kind of gone in a different direction as well. So we'll see. Maybe they're going to turn it around. Maybe they'll just keep on simplifying. We'll see, I guess. I know Bruce Nesmith is a really, really. I know he was definitely trying to push the envelope in terms of like he was trying to create like a whole new AI system and stuff like that. And he's been.
That's been brilliant. I mean, that's something I would, I love the direction that that's going in there, and seeing. I mean, I think that's very much in the spirit of Arena and Daggerfall, is to be walking around the street and seeing 2 random people get into a fist fight, and you know, why are they in the fight when like you watch the fight happen? I mean, that's when you see that happen, it's kind of magical. You know, it's uh, it especially when you know that you're not in, you know, massively multiplayer game where the people who are fighting aren't fighting because they're, you know, two dickheads who are just decided to fight in the middle of the street. There's some story behind that.
Yeah, I love the idea of like emergent gameplay like that, where, you know, you could just happen across something that happened to happen in front of you. It wasn't planned. It wasn't scripted. It just happened to happen there. And you're like watching it. You could choose to intervene or not, and things like that. Like it was a bit ridiculous sometimes in Oblivion because it was so new and they were kind of working out the rough edges. But I liked how the little conversations where people just walk up and start talking about what's happening over in the other town and, you know, history and things like that. They had a very kind of basic AI system for that, but I thought it was really cool.
No, you can kind of get into a little uncanny valley thing, even on the AI and that, where you're like, okay, that's not really how people interact, you know, on the street.
Yeah. Yeah, like the famous ones, there's whole YouTube compilations of it where it's like, you know, hello, have you heard of blah? No, I haven't. Nice talking to you. Goodbye. You know, just like that's the entire conversation. But I like the idea. The idea is really, really solid, I think.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So what's your favorite job well, I mean, I guess in any industry, but are you more of a writer? Do you like snare design, world building, system design, game mechanics? What is the niche that you like to fill, or you think you feel you're best at?
Well, what I'm probably best at is writing. So it's in general. So it could be, you know, writing dialogue for people who you run into, or you know, writing books, you know, that you find in game. And that's enough of an all-encompassing, you know, group that you know, things can fall into. World building was always a pleasure for me, and even you know, kind of post Daggerfall, once I ceased to sort of have a real control over the world, it's still a pleasure to, you know, okay, well, let me wrangle what I understand about the world into you know, what I consider a coherent narrative. And like I said, like post Bethesda Softworks, I've worked in, you know, making, you know, doing screenplays for movies and TV and stuff. So, you know, writing has continued to be a major thing that they're working on, and on the game that I'm will be coming out with soon. I didn't have very much to do with the gameplay, but I wrote some short stories for it. I wrote a bunch of dialogue for it, and I did a good amount of world building where, you know, they said they had a kind of idea of this is going to be kind of a dark fantasy world, and this is what's going to happen in it, and there's going to be a Lord of Chaos and a Vampire Lord, and figuring out what the background is of this world and why these characters would be at odds, and that's a ton of fun to try to figure out. So those are two. I mean, world building and writing are probably my strengths, but I love when I can figure out, based on what I'd like to do with the narrative, a gameplay mechanic that works with that. So again, coming back to like Elder Scrolls and saying a world in which you can do whatever you want to do and travel the world and be all of these different groups, then you start figuring out, okay, well, what kind of character creation do you need to have in order to create that? And then you get into some mechanics, which are probably not my strength, but conceptually, I like to think of those things.
Yeah, it's cool. It sounds like you'd be great at like board games and tabletop games. I don't recall. Did you ever do a tabletop RPG design or anything like that?
I've played a lot of them, but I've never actually been a designer of them.
Yeah, what's great about those is that essentially they can pretty much be done by anybody if you just have enough dedication and patience and go through the process, because you don't need to program, you can hire art or whatever, but it's very mechanical, but it's also very, the theme, like the perfect board game or perfect tabletop game is like the theme and the mechanics just like, dovetail perfectly, where, this mechanic is kind of like stealing. So the theme should be about like, thieves or, some really, really clever games. And there's a bit of a revival recently as far as tabletop games and tabletop RPGs. I think there was kind of a lull there in the 90s and 2000s, but it seems to be kind of coming back. So I was curious if you ever done anything like that.
No, I haven't. But I know what you're talking about.
Cool. All right. So any, we've already, we've already shared a few, but any other interesting or funny anecdotes in your time in game design or writing? Doesn't have to be Elder Scrolls related, but I was just curious if you had any interesting moments you haven't shared yet.
Of course, there's always a part where I'm trying to figure out what I should say. Because, I mean, a lot of these guys are still my friends. So, it's...
Is it admissible in court or not, basically?
Well, that is the question. Can we come back to that?
Sure, go ahead. Yeah, it's totally fine. All right.
Or were there another? What was that last question?
No, there's a few more. We're toward the end now. We've already actually covered this. I didn't know that you were still doing games as recently as like right now. So yeah, but are you continuing to do games more, or are you working on any projects after this one that's coming out in a couple weeks, or you're still open to games? I'm guessing because you're still writing one. But yeah, the question was, would you be interested in designing games again? But we've already answered that basically. So
sure. No, I mean, and there's a part where it was fun when we first got in contact, because you did the interview with Julian, who I probably hadn't seen. I'm going to say 10 years, but it might have been longer. And it was fun talking. Like the interview made me think about game ideas that we had talked about, 25 years ago. And I went ahead and jotted them down just because, like, I'm going, okay, well, if ever the fates align and it makes sense to work together on something, these are the things that we should talk about again.
Did you ever get a hold of him? I gave you that email address.
I did. You sent me his email address, and I haven't heard back from him. So I'm hoping that that he doesn't have some sneaky anger at me. That
I don't think so.
Joking. I'm joking.
He does. He's really busy. Sometimes he's taking like a week or more to get back to me. So hopefully he's just really busy and hasn't written you back. Yeah. But I'm from everything I've heard, he has nothing but good things to say about you. But maybe he secretly hates you. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's always possible. Sorry.
Oh no, totally fine. Let's see. So, if you had complete creative control in the magical land of complete creative control over a new role-playing game, what would your elevator pitch be?
I don't have an elevator pitch, and I always like an elevator pitch by its nature, like it's too simple for But I always think that a combination of procedural generation and what players bring to it is a game that is waiting to happen. And I guess the closest one to it is something like Minecraft, where it's something where you're given the tools. We'll give you some of the world. We'll kind of create some of the world. You're going to create things within the world, but imagine that like 100 times more sophisticated and like a world that is more intelligent than that, and more adult and nuanced. I mean, and I actually don't take anything against Minecraft. Like I think that was it's a really spectacular game considering where they started and where it went from. But my like the AI and having the characters who are wanting to take over and like that type of sort of palace intrigue is something that has always been interesting to me. So imagining something where the players can be part of the story and but they aren't the top of the story and they're not gods, but they are part of this whole world. I think that there's a lot that can be done with MMOs and procedurally generated worlds and melding them together.
That sounds interesting, and it's obviously ideas are a lot easier to do than actual products. But I've had a similar concept in that the idea is that the world would be generated, the world and activities and stuff would be generated around you, and depending on your actions, it would kind of go in different ways, and like almost a procedurally generated story. Like if you decide to go to the castle and answer the king's call, that's one story. If you decide to go over and hit up the bar and talk to travelers, that's another story. If you decide to steal from random nobles on the road, that's a completely different story. And like the world would kind of build itself and plots would build itself around you. Obviously that could be, the scope creep on that would be absolutely astronomical, but something like
the
that.
scope creep, again, that was a procedural generation aspect goes from. So there's a part where you go like, all right, well, if you talk to the nobleman and they say, imagine it was 1492, and then they said, well, go and find this new land if you want to, and we're like, okay, we're going to put you out to sea, and we're going to start creating a world around this quest, and you're going to deal with it.
No, I think that's awesome. I think that would be so much more compelling to the player than a game that you can, like if you could log into Wikipedia and read like everything that you did in a game, that's not really your story. It's just the story that the game designers built for you. But if you could go into a game and not ever be able to spoil what's going to happen next, that'd be amazing. I think that'd be
no, absolutely. I mean, and really the overall goal, I mean, we were talking about when you're in the world would be a thing where all the history that you read, like you would have books like in the Elder Scrolls lying around.
Yeah.
But if you open up a book that was about Patema the Wolf Queen, that character is not just made up by me. That was a real character who did things and lived this full life and died, and you're reading about it because it made a huge difference in this procedurally generated but intelligently acted out world. And that character may be still around. Maybe the person, maybe after, if you play Patema the Wolf Queen, and she dies, then you take over Euro the Third because that's her, the child that she was born to, or she gave birth to, and so you've taken over that character, and you jump to whatever character you've begat, and but the stories that you're reading are about your ancestors, and your ancestors being people that you've actually played before.
That's weirdly enough exactly what I was thinking. I was thinking kind of like a rogue light game or roguelike game where like once you're done playing, you either like retire or you die, and then the game would then add that to the lore and to the world. And so like you could run into the robber baron, group that you created last game, and you may defeat those, and then the next game you hear about the hero who defeated the robber barons, and stuff like that. Like that could be just kind of continue to go on. It sounds like too good to be true, but I'm sure somebody will be clever enough to figure out how to do that. So it obviously have to be very.
I don't think
I don't think it's impossible, but somebody had to really think of like programming wise and systems wise how that would work without making just a ridiculously impossible to make game. But that'd be something I would play for a unhealthy amount of hours, I think, where you're just like seeing how weird your world could get by like.
Well, yeah, you're like, how can I give it up when you are your character that you created in the beginning is now part of legend.
Yeah, exactly.
That character didn't make it eventually, but it is part of what crafted the world to begin with. So I think that would be awesome.
Yeah, I had some sort of idea. Obviously, can't use this title because it's a real book, but something like I Am Legend or something like that kind of concept where like every time you die or retire, you become part of the history and the lore, and you could actually be fighting, your descendants or taking orders from your descendants or whatever. Like that's so weird. It's almost like a terrarium of storytelling where you just like completely add new things to it and you build out your own world.
Right.
And how cool would that be? Like you said with the MMOs, like what if somebody else goes into that world and experiences your, and plays with it? I mean, that could be as big as Minecraft easily with the right tool. I mean, Minecraft is an amazing success story. That was built as a web game with Java. Like it was a really, really small scope, but yeah, I mean, that's ideas like that. I mean, there's more out there for sure, but yeah, that's awesome. It's funny how similar, I guess, because we both, you made one of my favorite games. I probably kind of have seeded some ideas from that, but that's really interesting. Okay, so are there trends in the game industry that turn people from like you away from like AAA development? I think we talked about like crunch time and stuff like that, but I know that Julian kind of got burnt out from the industry from that. But are there trends and common things you run into that kind of turn you away from game development? The industry?
No, I mean, I think that I think I mentioned this before that like at the time we were doing even the first Elder Scrolls, that they were considered to be kind of lower brow than what had come before them. So I don't think that there's a part where like, oh, the Elder Scrolls games have been dumbed down, so much that that's a big problem. I mean, I think that there's a part as far as turning away from the industry, and like I said, I still have some fingers in the industry. I remember when I was working at Electronic Arts, and one of the designers I was working with threw out a comment that said, "No one should be a game designer after 30." And I was flattered because I was like 35. So I was like, oh, he doesn't know. And there's a part where I think he's wrong, but I can kind of almost see the other argument where I go, the industry changes so much, and there's also a part where even nowadays you can work so many bloody hours that if you don't have a family, then that makes a lot more sense than it did in your 20s when that was an option. So I don't know if the industry has certainly changed in a lot of ways, but it wasn't something that turned me off against the industry. I mean, I think there's a part where yeah, it's not as simple as saying that there are. I mean, do I love all games that come out? No, and do I love all trends? No, but it's not that there's an overall negative trend that I think is permanent.
Okay. I was just curious if you thought there's like one thing that you saw that was getting worse, or one thing you think right now is a problem that might kind of take away creativity.
But I mean, we're talking about things like the procedural generation thing, which is a thing which I wish that the industry would just say, this is interesting. We can do something more with this, and with more juice in it, we can really make this into world building and and stuff that it's procedural generation. I think, like you said, not just for the world, but for quests and for characters and things like that, where it's like, we're really, I mean, obviously we know Google and all these things are paying so much attention to you in the real world. Yeah. If we just use that to say, we're going to pay attention to you in this fictional world, and we're going to make things more interesting for you in whatever way, that we realize that you are the social player who wants to have more palace intrigue, or know you're somebody who wants to delve into dungeons and beat the crap out of things. It shouldn't be that hard to say, let's create a universe that is around the kind of gameplay that you want to play. So it's not so much a trend that I'm against. I think that a lot of the trends in the industry are interesting, but I think that there could be some resources put in a different way.
Okay. Final question. Anything you'd like to share to your fans and followers of your work?
Well, I'll give you my website address for my business, www.witclothier.com or witclothing.com. Okay. That's what I've been doing, and that's where I am right now. And I'll give you the website address for the video game series that I'm working on, and there are some short stories that I've written that are up on their website right now. I mean, other than that, I can't imagine that I'm going to be completely divorced from the industry ever. I mean, I don't think there's ever been a month that I haven't had something in the works in the video game industry, whether it's, come to fruition or not. So I'm not giving up.
That's great to hear. I'm really happy to hear that. I unfortunately talked to a couple people who've kind of moved on. They still want to, but they're kind of moved on. But it's awesome that you're having a game come out. That's great. So yeah, I'm looking forward to hear whatever else you have in store for us. So yeah, thanks so much for doing this interview. I know it's kind of, you watched the Julian one, so you probably had a rough idea how long it was going to take. Hopefully it wasn't too long for you. But yeah, thanks so much. I really appreciate you coming on. And now that I've talked to you and Julian, I might have to talk to VJ just to get the trio of Arena.
Yeah, I think that's only fair.
All right. Thanks so much, Ted. I really appreciate it, and best of luck for you in the future. And yeah, so thanks so much, and have a great day, man.
You too.